The plate came apart before the readout finished loading. Adept Soul Raven saw it happen from behind the observation glass, all four of his hands still on the console, and for a moment his eyes refused the evidence in front of them. The test slab was conquered line armor, ceramic-laced alloy rated to stop a lance round at close range, bolted into a frame designed to hold it steady while the instruments recorded whatever the girl did to it. It was not supposed to move. It was supposed to sit there and take the sound and log a number. Instead, it had crazed edge to edge in the space of a single breath, a web of white fractures blooming through the dark alloy like frost across a pond, and then it had simply let go of itself. The pieces did not fly. They fell. They dropped straight down out of the frame and rang once against the deck and lay still, and the frame held nothing but empty air. On the far side of the glass, in the calibration chamber, the human closed her mouth. She did not look pleased. She did not look anything. She stood on the marked circle where they had placed her, hands loose at her sides, and she looked at the ruined frame the way a person looks at a chore they have finished, and then she looked up through the glass at Raven as if to ask whether that had been enough. "Log it," Prefect Ilvin said. Raven logged it. His hands did the work while the rest of him tried to catch up. He had performed the augmentation himself 11 days ago in the long surgical suite 2 decks down, and he had told the prefect at the time that the projections were optimistic. Conquered modeling had a way of being optimistic. The Directorate wanted a certain outcome, and its instruments learned to want it too. The number that filled his readout was not optimistic. It was past the top of the scale. The instrument had stopped trying to measure and simply reported that measurement had ceased to be meaningful. "Again," the prefect said. His name was Ilvin Korud, and he was Draloth, tall even for his people, his skin the deep slate purple of the old holdings, and he wore the gray half-cloak of the Augmentation Directorate over an officer's underharness as though the two authorities were one thing, which on this station they were. He stood with his hands folded behind him and watched the human through the glass with the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic he liked. "Adept," he said when Raven did not move, "load another plate. The frame is compromised. Then load it into the auxiliary frame, and we will replace the primary." Raven keyed the request down to the chamber crew. Through the glass he watched 2 Settery handlers in padded suits with a fresh slab across the deck on a loader, keeping well back from the human as they worked, giving her the wide berth that people give a thing they have decided is dangerous even when it is standing still. She let them work around her. She watched the new plate go into the auxiliary frame with the same flat attention she gave everything, and when the handlers had retreated behind the blast line, she returned her gaze to the glass and waited. "She waits well," the prefect observed. "She is disciplined," Raven said. "She is patient. There is a difference, and I find I prefer the second one." Korud tilted his head a degree. "Tell her." Raven leaned to the chamber channel. He had learned over 11 days that the girl responded to plain words and disliked ceremony, so he gave her plain words. "New plate is set, Ren. When you're ready." She nodded once. She set her feet. She breathed in and out and in, and Raven found himself holding his own breath the way one does at a height, and then she made the sound. He could not have described it afterward, and he had heard it 4 times now. It was not a scream. Screaming he could have filed under things he understood. It was low and it was even, and it seemed to come from somewhere beneath the register a body that size should be able to reach, and it did not rise or fall or crack. It simply held. It held the way a girder holds, a single sustained note with no waver in it at all, and it went through the glass and through the deck and through the small bones of Raven's inner ears and set something in his back teeth ringing. The plate did what the first plate had done. It stopped being a plate. The note cut off clean. Silence dropped into the chamber like a lid. "Log it," Korud said, and this time he was almost gentle about it, the way a man is gentle when he has gotten exactly what he came for. Raven logged it. Down in the chamber, the human worked her jaw once, side to side, and swallowed and touched 2 fingers briefly to the front of her own throat, the only sign, in 4 tests, that any of this cost her anything at all. Then she let the hand fall and stood waiting to be told what came next. "That will do for today," the prefect said into the channel, and to Raven, quieter, "Bring her up. I want the throat imaged before she rests, and adept." He turned from the glass at last, and his eyes, when they found Raven, were bright and satisfied and entirely without warmth. "You built better than you promised. The Directorate will remember it." He left the observation deck with the unhurried stride of a man whose day had gone well, and the hatch sealed behind him, and Raven stood alone with the console and the empty frames and the number that had no meaning, and he did not feel like a man who had built something well. He felt like a man who had opened a door without checking what was on the other side of it. Down in the chamber, the human was looking up at the glass again. She could not see him through it. From her side it was a mirror. But she was looking anyway, steady, patient, waiting, and Raven had the uncomfortable sense that she knew exactly where he was standing. They had told Wren Calloway that the enhancement was for her own protection. She had not believed them then, and she did not believe them now, sitting on the edge of the imaging table 2 decks up, while a med drone the size of her fist orbited her jaw and throat and hummed to itself. But she had learned a long time ago that the belief was not the point. The point was to be here, awake, watching, and to keep track of what was true underneath what she was told. Her grandmother had taught her that, on a colony that no longer existed, in a language the conquered did not bother to translate. "You do not argue with the weather," her grandmother used to say. "You learn which way it moves." The weather here moved toward her throat. She had come up to the colonnade. That was the station's name, though the conquered numbered it something and the Ostrani called it something else. As a medical orderly, 18 months ago, one of 300 human auxiliaries seconded to the Settery conquered under the protective enlistment. Protective was a word that did a great deal of work. Earth had signed the enlistment 2 years after first contact, when the conquered survey fleet cataloged the homeworld as a Ferex-class death world and decided, in the careful, bloodless way of large institutions, that it would rather have humanity inside the tent than outside it. So humans went out into the conquered's border reaches to carry supplies and mind wounded and dig latrines, and were paid in scrip, and told they were partners, and mostly it was tedious and cold and far from home. And then, 4 months ago, a Directorate assessor had watched Wren singing. She had not been performing. She had been alone in a supply bay with a burst coolant line and 40 minutes to wait for a repair crew, and she had sung to pass the time, the way she had sung her whole life, the way her mother had and her grandmother before that, a plain old soprano line with nothing behind it but a good ear and a long breath. She had a voice. She had always had a voice. On Earth it might have taken her somewhere. Out here it took her to the assessor's attention, and the assessor's report, and 11 days ago it took her to the long surgical suite and the 4-armed doctor with the careful hands. The med drone chimed and settled into a cradle by the wall. The imaging was done. "You held the note longer this time," Raven said. He was standing near the door, all 4 hands folded, watching the results scroll across the wall. He did that, folded his hands, when he was uneasy. She had noticed. She noticed a great deal about him. 0.6 of a second longer than the second test. You should not need to. The effect is well past threshold at half that duration. "It's steadier if I finish the breath," Wren said. "You were told to stop at threshold." "I was told to break the plate." She reached for the cup of water on the tray and drank, and her throat felt the way it always felt now, not sore exactly, but present, a warmth low in the front of her neck like a coal banked under ash. "It broke. I finished the breath." Raven was quiet for a moment. On the wall behind him, her own throat turned slowly in cross-section, and it did not look like anything she recognized. The pale architecture of it threaded now with lines of grafted tissue that were not hers, a lattice the conquered had grown and woven and tuned. She looked at it the way she had looked at the broken plate. A thing that had been done. A thing to keep track of. "Do you know what they're going to ask you to do with it?" Raven said. It was not quite a question. "Break things," Ren said, "bigger than plates." The doctor said nothing. "I'm not stupid, Adept." She set the cup down. "You don't rebuild a person's throat to protect them. You could protect me with a wall. You did this to make me into the wall's problem." She looked up at him, calm, and she watched him fail to meet her eyes, and she filed that too. "You want to know if I'm going to be difficult about it?" "I want to know," Raven said slowly, "whether you understand what you are now." Ren considered that. Outside the viewport, the contested world hung in the dark, brown and green and streaked with weather, and somewhere down on its surface were the holdfasts she was not supposed to know about, the ones the briefings called strongpoints, and the handlers called nests when they thought no auxiliaries were listening. She had been listening for 18 months. She understood a great deal about what she was. "I understand," she said, "that 11 days ago I could break a coolant line by accident, and now I can break your best armor on purpose." She stood and reached for her jacket, and the doctor stepped back to give her room without seeming to notice that he had done it. "What I don't understand yet is what you built me to break. When I understand that, I'll know what I am." She pulled the jacket on and left him there, with the image of her throat turning slowly on the wall. The Directorate did not waste time. 3 days after the 4th test, Raven was summoned to the planning tier, and he went up through the station's bright cord center, where the light came down through the dome from the world below and washed everything in the pale gold of Severin's daylight. And he found the prefect standing over a tactical table with 2 officers Raven did not know and did not like on sight. The table showed the surface. It showed the largest of the holdfasts, a low, broad structure sunk into the flank of a river valley, ringed in the dull gray of Ostrani shellwork. The armor the small folk grew and layered and reinforced across generations. The material the conquered had spent 2 years and a great many soldiers failing to breach. On the table it glowed with annotation. Ranges. Approach corridors. Estimated occupancy. "Adept Raven," the prefect said without looking up, "come and see what you've made possible." Raven came and looked. 2 years, Korad said. 2 years the shellworks have held. You know the material, you've had samples in your own laboratory. Layered biosilicate, self-annealing, it heals faster than we can cut it. We have thrown lances at it and burners at it and 3 assault companies at it, and it holds because it was grown to hold, because these creatures have been growing armor against predators since before they could count. It is the finest passive defense in this arm of the border, and we cannot get through it." He looked up finally, and the satisfaction was back in his eyes. And then a Deathworlder opens her mouth, and it falls apart like cheap glass. One of the officers made a low sound of appreciation. Raven kept his 4 hands still. "How many?" he said. "How many what?" "Occupancy. Your table shows an estimate. How many are inside the holdfast?" The prefect's expression did not change, which told Raven more than any change could have. "The holdfast is a strongpoint of the Severin resistance," he said. "It is a legitimate." "How many, prefect?" "Enough," Korad said, and the word came down flat and final. "That when the shellwork comes apart, the resistance on this world ends in an afternoon." Which is the outcome the Directorate has been chartered to produce, and which you, Adept, have made achievable 11 months ahead of projection. He straightened. "You will prepare the asset for surface deployment. 9 days. She goes down with the assault, she opens the shellwork, and the conquered ends a 2-year insurgency in a single day, and every world watching this border learns what happens to strongpoints that think their armor makes them safe." Raven looked at the estimate on the table. He had spent enough time with conquered annotation to read what the numbers were not saying. Occupancy, not garrison, not combatants. Occupancy, the word you used for everyone who was inside. The soldiers and the ones who were not soldiers, and the ones too small or too old or too soft-bodied to be anything at all. all of them behind the gray shellwork that their grandmothers had grown to keep predators out. "You want her to break a shelter," Raven said. "I want her to break a strongpoint." "Full of?" "Adept." The prefect's voice did not rise. It never rose. That was the thing about Cora that Raven had never gotten used to. The man delivered the worst of what he said in exactly the tone he used for everything else. "You are a xenosurgeon. You are very good. You built the instrument, but you will not confuse building the instrument with deciding where it plays. That decision is made on this tier, by people with the standing to make it, and you do not have that standing. And if you continue to ask me questions in that tone in front of my officers, I will begin to wonder whether the adept who built the instrument can be trusted to maintain it." He let that sit. "Can he?" "He can," Raven said. "Then go and prepare the asset. 9 days." Raven went. He rode the central lift down through the pale gold light, past the imaging suites and the surgical tier and the long, quiet ward where the earlier work was kept, and he did not stop at his own laboratory. He went to the ward. He had not meant to. His hands had chosen the deck before the rest of him agreed to it. But the ward was where the truth of the Directorate lived, the part the tactical tables did not annotate, and he thought that if he was going to spend 9 days preparing a girl to break a shelter full of soft-bodied creatures who had done nothing but grow armor against the dark, he should at least walk past the last person he had done this to. The ward was bright. The Directorate kept it bright. Daylight from the dome piped down through the cord center so that even here, at the bottom of the good work, the light fell clean and gold across the beds. There were 6 beds. 5 were empty. In the 6th lay a human, a young man, and his eyes were open, and they tracked Raven across the room the way a plant tracks the sun slowly, without recognition. "Tomas," Raven said. The young man's name was Tomas Vey, and 8 months ago he had been an auxiliary too, a strong one, chosen for a different kind of enhancement. Reflex, density, the fast-twitch work the Directorate had been so proud of before it learned to be prouder of what it did to throats. The augmentation had taken. Tomas had been, for a while, exactly what the tables wanted. And then something in him had come loose, some part of the man that the enhancement had needed and used and worn through. And now he lay in the bright ward and tracked the light, and did not know his own name when it was said to him. Raven stood by the bed for a while. He did not touch the young man. There was nothing to say to him that he would keep. "I built you too," Raven said quietly in his own language which no drone in the ward would flag. "And I told myself the same thing I have been telling myself about her, that the building was the honest part, that where the instrument plays is someone else's charter." He looked at the slow tracking eyes. "I do not think I believe it anymore." Tomas Vey watched the light move on the ceiling and did not answer. And 2 decks up a prefect stood over a table counting a 2-year problem down to a single afternoon. And 11 days after the last cut of the knife, the newest instrument in the Directorate's collection sat in her quarters with her hand at her own throat, learning which way the weather moved. They gave Wren a handler for the surface preparation, and the handler was afraid of her, and she learned more from that fear than from anything the handler was assigned to teach. His name was Skell, and he was Vesari like the doctor, 4-armed. But where Raven moved like a man weighing every gram of himself, Skell moved like a man who had been told to stand next to a fuel line and smile. He walked her through the deployment rehearsals with a stylus held between 2 of his hands and a translation slate held in the other 2, and every time she inhaled deeply, out of habit, before speaking he flinched. Just slightly. A tightening across the flat planes of his face. He could not help it, and she did not make him try. "The approach," Skell said, on the 2nd day, tapping the slate. "You will be carried in an armored crawler to the marked position. You will not need to expose yourself. You speak from inside the crawler. The shellwork fails, the assault companies advance. You are an instrument. You do not fight. Do you understand?" "I understand the words," Wren said. "Show me the marked position." He showed her. The crawler would stop 200 meters from the holdfast south face, where the shellwork was thinnest and oldest, and she would be brought to a firing port and she would break it. And through the breach would come the assault companies she had watched drilling in the station's lower bays for 11 days. The ones who did not know yet that their 2-year war was about to be handed to a 19-year-old auxiliary with a rebuilt throat. 200 meters, Wren said. That's the range you tested me at. The range is well within tolerance. That's not what I asked. Skell's stylus stopped moving. You were tested at 4 meters, he said, reluctantly. The Directorate's modeling projects the effect scales with. Projects, Wren nodded slowly. She was learning the shape of the thing now, the way you learn a room in the dark, hands out, one surface at a time. They had built her and tested her at arm's length against a bolted plate, and now they were going to stake a 2-year war on a projection that said her voice would carry 200 meters and do to a living shelter what it had done to a slab in a frame. And if the projection was wrong, if the shellwork was thicker than they thought, or the range too great, or the material healed faster than it broke, then she would be a girl standing at a firing port with the whole assault waiting on her, and the failure would be hers. She understood something else too, standing there. The Directorate did not actually know what she was. They knew what she did to plates. They had a number that meant nothing and a projection built on top of it and a prefect who wanted an outcome, and between those 3 things they had convinced themselves they held a weapon. But a weapon is a thing you understand. They did not understand her. They had built a door and never checked what was on the other side, and neither, she admitted, had she. I'd like to see the material, Wren said. The shellwork. You said the doctor has samples. That is not part of the preparation. Make it part of the preparation. She said it without heat, the way she said everything, and she watched Skell weigh the risk of refusing a request from the asset against the risk of granting one, and she watched him decide that granting was safer, and she filed that too. Everything on this station could be moved if you found the fear it rested on. I will ask the adept, Skell said. Raven had the samples in his laboratory because he had asked for them months ago, before the throat work, when he was still telling himself he was a scientist and not a locksmith. There were 4 of them, palm-sized sections of Ostrani shellwork sawn from a battlefield ruin and shipped up to the colonnade in a sealed case, and they sat in a rack on his bench, dull gray, unremarkable, the finest passive armor in the border reach. He was turning one of them over in his upper hands when Skell's request came through, and he read it twice, and then he did something he had not planned to do. He approved it, and then he sent a second message, to the ward staff, canceling the sedative schedule on the human patient in bed 6 for the following morning. He told himself he did not know why. Wren came to the laboratory the next day. She looked at the samples for a long time without touching them, and then she picked one up. He had not given her permission and did not withhold it, and turned it in her fingers the way he had, and held it up to the daylight from the port. It heals, she said. Self-annealing, a cut closes over days, a crack faster, he watched her. It is a remarkable material. The Ostrani grow it in sheets and layer it. A mature holdfast has 40 or 50 layers, each one grown by a different generation. The oldest layers are 200 years deep. 200 years. She set the sample down gently, as though it might mind being dropped. They've been building the same wall for 200 years. Longer. This world has predators that make conquered soldiers look tame. The shellwork is how a soft-bodied species survives a hard world. It is not a weapon. It has never been a weapon. It cannot be aimed or fired. It only holds. And the conquered wants it gone because it holds too well. Wren looked at him, and there was nothing in her face but attention, and it unnerved him more than anger would have. You keep telling me things you're not supposed to tell me, adept. The occupancy of a strongpoint, the age of the walls, that it isn't a weapon. You're building a case. Who are you building it for? Raven set down the sample he was holding. There is a patient in the ward, he said. I would like you to meet him. Bed 6, the bright ward. Ren stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Thomas Vey, and Thomas Vey looked at the ceiling, and for a while neither of them said anything. Human, Ren said at last. An auxiliary, like you, enhanced 8 months ago by me. Raven stood a little apart, hands folded. A different modality, reflex strength. He performed to specification for 11 weeks. Then the augmentation began to draw on more than it gave, and there was nothing in the charter about what to do when that happened, because the charter does not admit that it can happen, and so he is here, and he tracks the light, and he does not know his own name. Ren moved to the side of the bed. She did not touch the young man. She looked at his open eyes and his slow face and the daylight moving on the ceiling that he watched instead of her, and something happened in her own face that Raven could not name. Not grief, not fear, something harder and more useful than either. "How long does mine last," she said, "before it starts drawing on more than it gives?" "I don't know. Guess. I built yours to be more efficient than his. I learned from him. The admission tasted like rust. It will last longer. I do not know how much longer. It could be years. It could be that the first time you sustain the note at full duration at surface range, against a target that heals as fast as it breaks, you will hold it and hold it and hold it because the shell work does not fail on schedule, and you will burn through in an afternoon what he burned through in 11 weeks. He made himself say the rest. The Directorate has not modeled that. The Directorate does not model the instrument's survival. It models the targets. Ren was quiet. In the bright ward the drone hummed and the light moved, and the young man who had been strong tracked it across the ceiling. "They tested me at 4 meters, she said. "They're deploying me at 200. They don't know if I'll reach. They don't know if the wall will fail before I burn out. They've got a number that means nothing and a prefect who wants a war finished by dinner." She looked up. "They don't know what I am, do they?" "No," Raven said. "I built you and I do not know what you are." "Then that makes 2 of us who'd better find out before the 9th day. She turned from the bed. "Show me everything, Adept. The material, the numbers, the ward, all of it. If I'm going to decide what I am, I want to decide it knowing more than they do." She spent the next 4 days learning the station, and she did it the way she did everything, quietly, patiently, moving the fear. The handlers feared her, so they answered her questions rather than risk her displeasure, and she asked questions that seemed idle and were not. She learned the layout of the assault bays and the number of companies, and the fact that 1/3 of the soldiers drilling down there were not conquered regulars at all but conscript auxiliaries like the humans, small folk and press-ganged border species, who had signed their own protective enlistments and been spent accordingly. She learned that the crawler that would carry her to the holdfast was one of 9, and that the other 8 would carry the first assault wave, and that the plan had them advancing the instant the shell work failed. She learned that the prefect had invited observers, 2 conquered fleet officers and a Directorate assessor, and on a relay from 3 systems away, a member of the Settery Oversight Council, to watch the 2-year war end in an afternoon. And she learned, from a nervous quartermaster who did not know he was telling her anything, that the holdfast's occupancy estimate had been revised upward twice, and that the revisions had not changed the plan, and that the word occupancy on the Concord's tables meant every warm body inside the gray walls, and that the last revision had put the number past 9,000. 9,000 soft-bodied creatures behind a wall their grandmothers had grown. Ren sat with that number in her quarters that night, her hand at her throat, the coal banked warm under the ash of her skin, and she did not feel angry. Anger was weather, and she had learned long ago not to argue with weather. She felt the thing her grandmother had meant, all those years ago, in the language the conquered did not translate. Not rage, reckoning, the cold, clear arithmetic of a person deciding which way she was going to move. They had built her to break a wall so that 9,000 could die behind it. They did not understand what they had built. They thought a voice that broke armor was a weapon of conquest, a thing to open shelters and let the killing in. But a voice that broke armor could break other things. It could break a lance in a soldier's hands. It could break the restraint on a crawler hatch. It could break the shackle on a spent auxiliary in a bright ward. It could break the guns before they fired and the doors before they opened and the whole careful machinery of an afternoon slaughter, and it did not have to kill anyone at all to do it. The Directorate had built a sword and handed it to a girl who had spent her whole life learning that the strongest thing in a hard world is not the blade. It is the wall. Wren Calloway sat in the pale gold light of a world she had never walked on and made a decision, and because she was who she was, she did not announce it, and she did not rage, and she did not weep. She simply began, very quietly, to plan. Raven knew something had changed in her, because she stopped asking him questions. For 4 days she had drained him of everything he knew, the material, the modeling, the ward, the layout, and he had given it to her because giving it to her was the only honest thing left to him. And then, on the 5th day, the questions stopped, and she came to the rehearsals calm and cooperative and exact, and did everything Skell asked, and held the practice notes to threshold and cut them clean, and thanked the handlers and went back to her quarters. And Raven understood that she had gotten what she needed from him and moved past him into some plan he was not part of. He found he did not resent it. He found he was, for the first time in months, hopeful, and the hope frightened him more than the number on the readout had. He was in the surgical tier, reviewing her throat images against the deployment schedule, when the prefect summoned him again. The planning tier was crowded this time. The observers had begun to arrive. The 2 fleet officers stood at the tactical table with the proprietary air of men who had come a long way to watch someone else win, and the Directorate assessor, a cephalopod-descended Concord elite, mottled gray, 4 eyes, hovered at the prefect's shoulder, and on a relay pillar in the corner glowed the projected form of the oversight counselor, slate purple like Korud, a noble of the same old holdings, watching the whole tier with the mild attention of power that expects to be pleased. "Adept Raven," the prefect said, "report on the asset." Raven reported. The throat had healed clean, the lattice was stable. The effect was consistent across 4 tests, and threshold was reached at half the sustained duration, and the projection for surface range held to the Directorate's confidence interval. He said all of it in the flat register the tier expected, and he watched the counselor's projected face receive it with mild satisfaction, and he thought about 9,000 soft bodies behind a gray wall, and he did not say that part, because there was no slot on the tier for that part. "And the asset's disposition," the counselor said. Its voice came filtered through 3 systems of relay and arrived smooth and cool. "I am told these Deathworlders can be temperamental. The Ferax rating is not decorative." "The asset is disciplined," Raven said. "The asset is patient," Korud corrected, with the small pride of a man quoting himself. "She waits well. She does what she is told, and she asks to see the material she is meant to break. Curiosity, not resistance. I have handled a dozen enhanced assets, and I know the difference." He turned to the counselor's projection. "In 4 days she opens the south face of the holdfast, and the Severin resistance ends, and this border learns the lesson. The Directorate delivers 11 months ahead of charter. I would ask the Council to remember which office delivered it." "The Council remembers offices that deliver," the counselor said, which was not quite a promise and was received as one. Raven looked at the tactical table, at the glowing holdfast and its annotated ranges, and he thought, they are all so certain. Every one of them in this bright tier is certain they understand the instrument. The prefect is certain she is patient. The counselor is certain she is disciplined. The assessor is certain the number means what the number says. And not one of them has noticed that the instrument stopped asking questions 4 days ago, and that a person who stops asking questions has usually found her answers. He said none of it. He gave the tier the report it wanted, and he went back down to the surgical suite, and he sat for a long time with the image of her throat turning on the wall, and he made a decision of his own, which was smaller than hers and cost him more, because he had more to lose and less courage to lose it with. He decided that when the 9th day came, whatever she did, he would not stop her. 2 days before deployment, Wren asked to see the crawler. It was a reasonable request and Skell granted it, and she was walked down to the assault bay in the pale gold light and shown the machine that would carry her to the holdfast. It was a low, broad armored thing, tracked, its hull the dull composite of Concord line vehicles, and at the front it had a firing port where a gunner would normally sit and where, on the 9th day, they would put her instead. She climbed up and looked through the port at the empty bay and the drill markings on the deck, and she put her hands on the port's frame, and Skell watched her from below with his stylus and his fear. "You will be secure here," he said. "The hull is rated to." "I know what the hull is rated to." Wren looked at the port frame under her hands. Composite, laced with the same ceramic alloy as the test plates, the same material she had reduced to gravel 4 times in a bright chamber 2 decks up. She looked at it and she understood, with the cold clarity that had been growing in her for 5 days, that the Directorate had built her a machine she could take apart from the inside as easily as she could take apart a wall from the outside. They had put the instrument inside the weapon. They had not thought it through, because they did not understand the instrument, because they had built a door and never once, not one of them, walked around to check the other side. "Yes," Wren said, "I'll be secure here." She climbed down. She thanked Skell, who flinched, and she let herself be walked back up through the gold light to her quarters, and she sat on the edge of her bunk with her hand at her throat, and she went over the plan one more time, the whole shape of it, the crawler and the port and the range and the guns and the shackle and the bright ward, and she found no flaw in it that she could fix, and several she could not, and she accepted them the way her grandmother had taught her to accept the weather. You do not argue with it. You learn which way it moves. And then, if you are very patient and very cold and you have spent your whole life underestimated by people who mistake quiet for weakness, you move first. The counselor was not satisfied with a projection. Raven learned this the way he learned most things now, second-hand and too late, when Skell came to the surgical suite gray-faced and said that the observers wanted a demonstration at range before they would commit their names to the deployment record. A projection was modeling. Modeling could be wrong, and a counselor 3 systems away did not put his standing behind modeling. He wanted to see the instrument break real shell work at real distance, and he wanted to see it before the 9th day, and the prefect had agreed, because the prefect wanted the counselor's name on the record more than he wanted the girl unstressed. When Raven said, "Tomorrow, the lower hangar. They are bringing up a section." A section of what? Skell would not meet his eyes, which by now Raven understood was the station's native language. A wall section, from a holdfast the 2nd Company took last season. Genuine shellwork, 40 layers, 200 years deep. They have mounted it in the hangar. He hesitated. The counselor asked whether the material would be occupied. For accuracy, the prefect said that would not be necessary. Something cold moved through Raven's 4 hands. The counselor asked whether they should put people behind it. "For accuracy," Skell said again, miserably, and left. They brought Wren down to the lower hangar in the morning, and Raven came too, and the observers were already there. The section stood in the middle of the hangar deck like a fragment of a ruined city, a curved slab of gray shellwork 3 times a man's height and twice as wide, mounted upright in a heavy frame that the station's engineers had built to hold it steady. It did not look like armor. It looked like something grown, layered, ridged, the surface pitted and healed and pitted again where 200 years of a hard world had tested it. Raven had held a palm-sized piece of it in his laboratory and thought it remarkable. Standing before 3 tons of it, he understood for the first time what the Concord had been failing to breach for 2 years, and why the prefect wanted so badly to be the office that finally did. The observers stood behind a blast line at 50 meters, the 2 fleet officers. The mottled assessor with its 4 eyes. The counselor, present only as a glowing projection on a mobile pillar, watching from 3 systems away through a lens that made everything it saw a report. The prefect stood with them, and he had the girl brought to a marked position, and the position was not 50 meters from the wall. It was 150. Range 150, Korad announced, for the record and for the counselor. Below the deployment range of 200 to establish the effect before we commit to the surface figure. The asset will break the section on my mark. He looked at Ren, small on her marked circle in the vast bright hangar, dwarfed by the wall she had been brought to break. You understand the demonstration? I understand it, Ren said. Raven watched her from beside the console where he had been told to log the result, and he saw what the observers did not see, because they were looking at the wall and he was looking at her. He saw her measure the distance with her eyes. He saw her look at the wall, the real wall, 200 years deep, 40 layers grown by 40 generations of soft-bodied creatures who had never once used it to hurt anyone. He saw her set her feet. And he saw, in the half-second before she breathed in, something pass across her face that was not doubt and was not fear. A decision, made and closed, like a hatch sealing. She breathed in, she made the sound. It filled the hangar. It was the low, even sustained note he had heard 4 times, and here in the open space it did not have glass and deck to run through. It had air, 300 meters of it, and it crossed the distance and struck the ancient wall and the wall. The wall cracked. A single fracture opened across the gray face, high up, a jagged white line that ran 1/3 of the way down and stopped. The note held. Raven watched the fracture and waited for it to bloom the way the test plates had bloomed, edge to edge, the whole thing letting go at once. It did not bloom. The crack held where it was, 1 line in 3 tons of shell work, and the note held on it, and then, days of healing compressed into seconds, the crack began visibly to close. Ren cut the note. She staggered just slightly. 1 step, caught and corrected, her hand going to her throat, and she stood breathing hard on her marked circle 150 meters from a wall she had cracked and not broken, and the crack sealed itself over as they watched until only a pale seam remained to say it had ever been there at all. Silence in the hangar. That, said one of the fleet officers, was not what the report promised. The prefect's face did not change, but Raven, who had spent 11 days learning to read the small country of it, saw the muscle move at the hinge of his jaw. The range was 150, Korad said. The section is unusually thick. The deployment target's south face is the thinnest and oldest. The report, the assessor said in its cool, rippling voice, 4 eyes on the ceiling seam, projected a total structural failure at 200 meters. This is 150, and I observe a single fracture healing. The projection appears to have been optimistic. The word landed in the bright hangar, and Raven heard it as his own word, the one he had used to the prefect 11 days ago and been ignored for. Optimistic. He looked at Ren, still catching her breath on the circle, hand at her throat, and he understood what she had done, and the understanding went through him like cold water. She had sandbagged them. He had seen her break conquered line armor at 4 meters as though it were sugar glass, past the top of the instrument scale, the number that had no meaning. He knew what she could do, and she had stood in front of the observers and the counselor and the prefect's ambition, and cracked a wall 1/3 of the way through and let it heal, and staggered convincingly, and touched her throat, and made 3 tons of ancient shellwork look like the edge of what she could manage instead of a fraction of it. She had made them doubt the instrument. She had made them think the deployment was closer to the edge than it was, and Raven could not fathom why, until he could, and then he wished he could not. She was managing the plan. She wanted them uncertain. An uncertain prefect changed the deployment, tightened the range, shortened the approach, brought the crawler closer to the wall so the instrument would be sure to reach. She was not trying to look strong. She was trying to bring herself closer to the holdfast, where whatever she truly intended to do would be done at a range she chose. Bring the range in, the counselor's projection said, unbothered, a noble adjusting a variable. You said the target's face is thinner. Move her deployment position to 100 meters. If the instrument needs to be close, put it close. I did not come to watch it half-work. It will be close, the prefect said, and Raven heard the humiliation cooling into resolve. 100 meters. The asset breaks the south face and the resistance ends. You have my standing on it. We shall see whose standing it is on, the counselor said, and its projection winked out. They took Ren back up through the gold light, and she let them, hand at her throat, unsteady, playing the strained instrument for whoever might be watching, and Raven walked a pace behind her and did not say a word, because he had finally understood that the girl he had built did not need his help. She needed his silence, and that at least he could give. Ren's throat hurt. That was the thing she had not told the doctor, the thing she kept behind the flat, calm face she showed the station. It hurt now, in a way it had not hurt after the plate tests, a deep hot ache low in the front of her neck that pulsed when she swallowed. She had cracked 3 tons of 200-year shellwork from 150 meters and held the note while it fought her, while it healed against her, and it had cost her. Tomas Vey lay in a bright ward tracking the light because the thing they built into him had drawn on more than it gave. She had felt, in the hangar, the first small draw of her own instrument reaching for more than she had. She did not have unlimited afternoons in her. That was the arithmetic now. Whatever she did on the 9th day, she would likely only be able to do once. So it had to be the right thing, done once complete. She sat in her quarters that night and she did not sleep, and near the middle of the station's dimmed cycle, there was a soft sound at her door, and it was the doctor. He should not have been there. There were drones in the corridors and schedules that logged who moved where, and a xenosurgeon visiting the asset's quarters in the dim cycle would be a line in a record somewhere that a suspicious prefect could read. He came anyway. He stood in her doorway with all 4 hands empty and held loosely at his sides, and he looked at her for a moment, and then he said quietly, in the plain words she preferred, "I know what you did in the hangar." Ren looked at him. "Say it plainer than that." "You can break that wall. You could have broken it from 200 meters. You could probably have broken it from the observation glass upstairs. And you cracked it a third of the way and let it heal and made yourself stagger, so that they would bring you in close, because at 100 meters inside the crawler at the port, you will be near enough to reach whatever it is you actually mean to reach." He drew a breath. "I do not know what that is. I do not want you to tell me, because if I know it I might be made to give it up. But I came to tell you one thing so that whatever you have planned, you plan it true." "Tell me then." "The instrument is drawing on you already. I saw you catch yourself. That was not a performance, part of it was, but not all. You have perhaps 1 full effort left in you at that intensity. Maybe 2, not a campaign. 1 act complete and then a long cost, and I cannot tell you how long or how much." He held her eyes, and for the first time since she had met him, the 4-armed doctor did not look away. "Whatever you are going to do, you get to do it once. Make it the thing that matters." Ren was quiet for a while. Outside her port, the contested world turned slowly, brown and green, 9,000 soft bodies asleep behind gray walls their grandmothers had grown. "Adept," she said, "there's a prisoner on this station, an Ostreni. The Directorate keeps it for study." She had learned it from the nervous quartermaster 3 days ago, folded into a complaint about ration logistics. "I want to see it, before the 9th day. Can you make that part of the preparation?" Raven went very still. "Why?" "Because I've been told for 18 months that the things behind those walls are the resistance, strongpoints, nests. Everyone on this station has a word for them that isn't people." She stood and crossed to the port and looked down at the turning world. "I'm going to decide what I am on the 9th day. I'd like to make the decision looking at what I'm deciding about, not a word on a table, the thing itself." The doctor was silent for a long moment. Then, "I can make it part of the preparation," he said. "The asset requests to observe a specimen of the target species, to calibrate. There is language for it. The prefect will approve it because he approves anything that sounds like the instrument taking its work seriously. A pause. You are very good at moving these people, Ren. I've been underestimated my whole life, Ren said, still looking at the world. You learn to use it or you learn to disappear. I never wanted to disappear. They kept the Ostrani in a study cell on the medical tier, and Raven took her there the next day under the cover of calibration, and Ren stood at the transparent wall of the cell and looked at the thing the Conquered wanted her to bury. It was small. That was the first thing. Smaller than she was, hunched low to the ground, its body soft and segmented, and the pale gray-green of a thing that had never needed a hard shell of its own, because it grew its shelter around itself instead. It had too many limbs, folded close, and a cluster of dark eyes, and it made a sound when it saw her, a low modulated warble that the cell's translator rendered after a moment into flat Conquered standard. Another one, the translator said, in the toneless voice it gave to everything. You have brought another one to look at me. Ren crouched down slowly, until she was at its level on the far side of the transparent wall. They tell me you're the resistance, she said, that you're a strong one, that behind your walls is a nest that has to be cleared. She kept her voice even plain, the way she kept everything. I don't think that's true. I've been on this station 18 months and everything true on it is something nobody's supposed to say, so I came to hear it from you. What's behind the walls? The small creature was quiet. Its cluster of eyes moved over her, her face, her throat, the pale seam of a healing scar Raven had not been able to fully erase. You are the singer, the translator said. They took one of your kind and changed her throat. We heard. Even here we heard. The Conquered could not break the shell in 2 years, so they built a mouth that could. The warble sharpened and the translator kept up. Behind the walls are the ones who cannot fight, the soft-shelled young, the old whose shells have gone brittle, the ones who tend and grow and mend. 9,000 in the great holdfast, and not one of them has ever held a lance, because we do not hold lances. We grow walls. It is the only thing our kind has ever done against the dark. We grow walls and we hold, and we have held for 200 years, until the Conquered found a girl and built her into a key. Ren looked at it for a long time. I'm not a key, she said at last and stood. She did not explain. She thanked the Ostrani prisoner, which seemed to confuse it, and she let the doctor take her back up through the gold light, and she went to her quarters and sat with her hand at her aching throat and finished the last of her planning. And the plan she finished was not the Conquered's plan, and it was not, she thought, a plan any of them could have imagined, because to imagine it they would have had to understand the instrument. And understanding the instrument would have required them to walk around to the far side of the door they had built, and not one of them, in the whole bright turning arithmetic of the colonnade, had ever bothered to do it. The thing that changed Ren's plan from a rescue into something larger came from a supply manifest. She had not gone looking for it. She had gone looking for the quartermaster again, the nervous one, the one who talked when he was anxious, and he was always anxious, because she wanted to confirm the loading order for the crawlers, and he had been standing over a manifest slate in the lower supply bay, and while he answered her questions his hands kept straightening a stack of intake requisitions he did not need to straighten, and Ren, who read hands the way the doctor folded his, looked down at the requisitions while he talked. They were candidate intakes, Directorate forms, and there were more than one. How many of us are there? Ren said when he finished. How many? Candidates for the augmentation. She kept her voice flat and idle, a person making conversation, and she watched his hands stop straightening. You've got a stack of intake forms there, and they're not all mine. How many is the Directorate screening? The quartermaster looked at the slate and then at her and then at the sealed hatch, and then, because he was afraid of her and fear talks, he told her. 9, he said. On this station, this cycle, you're the one they finished. There are 8 more in screening, 2 humans, the rest border species with the tolerance profile. The Directorate runs a screening cohort every cycle and advances the ones that model well. His hands found the stack again. You were the first to finish because you modeled best. But you're not, he stopped. I'm not the program, Ren finished for him. I'm the first unit off the line. The quartermaster did not answer, which was an answer. She took it to Raven that night, in the dim cycle, in the surgical suite where the throat images turned on the wall, because he was the only one on the station who would tell her the truth and be sickened by it in the same breath. There are 8 more, she said, in screening, and a new cohort every cycle. This isn't one prefect wanting one war finished. This is a program, a pipeline. They screen Deathworlders and border species with the tolerance. They advance the ones that model well. They finish the ones that finish, and they spend them. She looked at him. Tomas wasn't a mistake they learned from. He was an early unit. I'm a better one. And there are 8 behind me and 9 more next cycle. And if I go down to that valley and break the wall like a good instrument, or if I go down and break the assault and die doing it, the program doesn't stop. They log the result, adjust the model, and finish the next one. Her voice did not rise. It never rose. I could save 9,000 Ostreni and it wouldn't matter, because next cycle there's another key and another wall. Raven was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are right. I have known it for months and told myself it was above my charter. There is a Directorate document, I have seen the header, never the body, titled the Farax Program. You are Unit 4. There have been 3 before you and there are meant to be many after." He folded his 4 hands. Breaking the wall, or refusing to, or dying in the valley, none of it touches the program. The program does not care what any single unit does. It cares about the average. "Then I don't save 9,000, Ren said. "Or I don't only save 9,000. She stood at the port and looked down at the turning world, and the cold, clear arithmetic that had been building in her for days finished its work, and became something harder and more exact. I have to make the program too expensive to run. Not the wall, the story. I have to do the one thing in that valley that the Directorate can't log, adjust, and finish the next unit past. I have to make it so that every border watching learns that when you build a key out of a Deathworlder, the key turns in your hand in front of your own council and shields the people you aimed it at, and that the story spreads, and the small folk on 100 worlds hear it, and start to wonder whether the monster their enemies built might be the neighbor they've been looking for." She turned from the port. "That's the thing the model can't absorb. Not a broken wall, not a dead unit. A weapon that publicly, calmly in front of the Council's own eyes refused. That's expensive. That's the only thing that's expensive enough." Raven looked at her, small, plain, ruin-throated in the making, standing in the dim light of a station that had built her to be spent, and he understood that she had just moved past saving a holdfast into something colder and larger and far more dangerous to the people who owned her. She was not planning a rescue. She was planning a lesson, the kind that does not end a war so much as end the appetite for a certain kind of war, and she was planning to teach it with the one afternoon and the one voice she had. "The observers," he said slowly. "The counselor, you want them there. You have wanted them there all along. That is why you cracked the wall in the hangar and let it heal, not only to be brought in close, but to be sure the counselor came to watch the deployment himself instead of trusting a projection. You need the audience." "I need the audience," Ren agreed. "A weapon that turns where no one important is watching is a malfunction. A weapon that turns in front of the council is a story. The Directorate can bury a malfunction. It can't bury a story that a sitting counselor watched with his own eyes and 3 fleet officers filed reports on. That's the difference between saving one wall and making them stop building keys." She sat on the edge of the imaging table, and for the first time she let a little of the weight show in her flat, calm face. "It costs more this way, Adept. I know that. If I only wanted to save the holdfast, I could break the assault fast and hope to survive it. But making it a story means holding the note past where it's safe, in front of everyone, until there's no version of it that reads as a malfunction, until it's undeniable that the instrument chose. And you told me I get maybe 1 full effort. Making it a story might cost me the whole thing. She met his eyes. I've decided it's worth the whole thing. I wanted you to know that before the 9th day, so that when I hold the note past where you tell me to stop, you don't waste your breath telling me to stop. I'll have decided already. I decided tonight. Raven stood in the dim surgical suite with the image of her throat turning slowly on the wall behind him. The throat he had built, the instrument the Directorate had made of a girl's voice, and he did not tell her to stop. He had promised himself days ago that whatever she did, he would not stop her. He understood now that the promise was going to cost more than he had imagined when he made it, and he found that he meant to keep it anyway. Then I will build you the floor, he said, and I will not waste my breath. And Ren, when it is a story, when the boarder hears it, make sure the story is the true one. Not that the Deathworlders are strong. They already fear that. Make sure the story is that the strong thing chose to be a shield. That is the version they cannot build a weapon to answer. He drew a breath. Strength they can match with strength. A predator that protects the prey that they have no model for at all. That's the version, Ren said quietly. That's the only version I'm interested in telling. The hangar demonstration had cost the prefect something in front of the counselor, and Ilving Korud was not a man who absorbed a cost without looking for someone to hand it to. He began, in the days before deployment, to tighten. Raven felt it the way one feels a pressure change before weather, a stiffening in the corridors, more drones on the medical tier, a new pair of Dreyloth security officers who stood outside the surgical suite and logged everyone who came and went. The prefect had decided that a demonstration falling short of its projection was a failure that belonged to someone, and since it could not belong to him, and since the counselor's confidence was the thing he most needed to protect, he had begun to audit his own station for the flaw. He summoned Raven to the planning tier alone. The section in the hangar, Korud said without preamble. He was standing at the tactical table and the holdfast glowed on it, and the deployment range had been redrawn at 100 meters in a harder, brighter line. 200 years thick. The projection said total failure at 200 meters and she cracked it a third of the way at 150. Explain the discrepancy, adept, in detail. The counselor will want it in the record, and I will want to believe it before he does. Raven had prepared for this because he had learned to prepare for the prefect the way one prepares for a hard frost. The section was atypical, he said. Battlefield salvage mounted upright in a rigid engineering frame. The frame changes the resonance. A wall grown into the ground, curved under its own load, behaves differently from a slab bolted into steel. The projection modeled a grown structure. We demonstrated on a mounted one. The discrepancy is the frame, not the instrument. He paused and added, because a lie is stronger with a true grievance folded into it. I told the Directorate at the outset that the modeling was optimistic. It was not a criticism of the asset. It was a criticism of the confidence interval, which the counselor has now seen for himself. The prefect watched him with his bright, cold eyes, and Raven held them, because a man who looks away has something to hide, and a man who holds them might merely be telling the truth. And after a long moment Korud inclined his head a fraction. The frame, he said. You will put that in the record in exactly those words and you will stake your standing on it. I will. Good, the prefect turned back to the table. Because I have been thinking, adept, about the ways this could go wrong, and most of them lead back to the man who built the instrument and does not seem to enjoy his own success. You question the occupancy. You ask how many. You visit the ward. You take the asset to see the specimen. He said it all mildly, a list, a man reading an inventory. I have the logs, I read them. None of it is forbidden. All of it is the behavior of a conscience, and a conscience, adept, is a luxury the Directorate does not issue with the Commission. I am watching you. I want you to know that so that if you are considering being a problem, you consider also that I have already begun to count the ways. Raven kept his 4 hands still. I built the instrument, Prefect. I want the deployment to succeed as much as you do. It was, he thought, the truest lie he had ever told, because the deployment he wanted to succeed was not the one on the table. My conscience, as you call it, is why the throat healed clean and the lattice is stable and the asset is calm. A careless surgeon would have given you another patient for the ward. I gave you an instrument that works. You are welcome to resent the temperament and keep the results." The prefect looked at him for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he almost smiled. "That," he said, "was well said. Go back to your suite, adept. 2 days. Keep the instrument calm and the record clean, and when the south face comes down and the counselor puts his name to the outcome, I will forget I ever counted." He turned away. "And if it does not come down, if the frame you have just staked your standing on turns out to be a convenient story, I will remember every line of the logs, and you will have a bed in your own ward. Do we understand each other?" "We understand each other," Raven said, and went, and did not let the tremor into his hands until the hatch had sealed behind him. Wren had 2 days, and she spent the first of them making contact with the only people on the station she could not move with fear, because they were as afraid as she was, and fear does not push fear. There were, by her count, 41 human auxiliaries still aboard the colonnade, orderlies and porters and coolant techs, seconded under the protective enlistment and spread thin through the lower decks. She knew a dozen of them by name. She found the one she trusted most, a broad, quiet porter named Odell who had been on the station longer than she had, in the ration queue in the lower mess, and she stood beside him with her tray and spoke without turning her head, the way you learn to speak in places that log everything. "On the 9th day they're taking me down to the surface," she said, "to the assault bay and out with the first wave. You know what I am now. Everyone knows." "Everyone knows," Odell agreed quietly to his tray. "When they move me down to the bay, there'll be a window, an hour, maybe less, while they load the crawlers and the observers get seated, and the whole station's watching the tactical feed instead of the lower decks." She took a slow breath. "I need the auxiliaries off the assault companies. The human ones, the small folk ones, the conscripts. When the wave goes, they go with it in the 2nd and 3rd crawlers. I need them not to be in the crawlers." Odell was silent for a moment. "That's 40-50 people," he said. "You want them to just walk off the assault. There's Drayloth security on every deck. Where do they walk to?" "The medical tier, the ward and the study cells. It's the one place on the station security thins out during a surface operation, because there's nothing there worth guarding when the whole show's on the ground." She had walked it in her head a dozen times. "Tell them there's a med muster. Tell them the Directorate wants auxiliary medics staged on the tier for casualty intake when the wave comes back. It's a real order shape. Skell would give it if I asked him to, and he will ask no questions because he's afraid of me. I'll have the order cut. You just make sure our people believe it and go where it sends them." "And then what?" Odell said, "when the wave goes down without them?" "Then they're on the medical tier," Wren said, "instead of in a crawler 200 meters from a wall I'm about to bring down on the Concord instead of on the Ostreni." She said it plainly, evenly, to her tray, and beside her Odell went very still. "You wanted to know the plan. That's the part of it that keeps our people alive. Will you carry the word?" Odell ate for a while in silence. Then he said, 18 months I've watched them work us like machines and pay us in scrip and call it a partnership. My cousin went down on the 2nd Company's assault last season and came back in a bag they wouldn't let us open." He set down his utensil. "I'll carry the word. Med muster, medical tier, 9th day. You get the order cut and I'll make sure every one of ours believes it." He glanced at her once sideways. "What are you, Wren? Really?" Wren thought about the wall in the hangar, the crack that healed, the small gray-green creature that grew shelters instead of weapons, the young man in the bright ward tracking the light. "I'm the wall," she said. "They built me to be the key and I decided to be the wall." She picked up her tray. "Med muster, 9th day." "Thank you, Odell." She spent the 2nd day with Tomas Vey, though he did not know it. She had asked Raven plainly whether the spent augment in bed 6 could be moved, and Raven had said that he could, physically, that there was nothing keeping him in the ward but the Directorate's disinterest in what became of a used instrument. So Wren went to the bright ward on the pretext of calibration. The asset observes the outcome of prior augmentation. There was language for it, and she sat by bed 6, and she talked to the young man who did not know his name, and she made her last arrangements around him. "They're going to move you," she said. It didn't matter that he couldn't follow it. She was saying it to fix it in herself. When the wave goes down and the tier empties out, there'll be 40 of ours on this deck, and one of them is a med tech named Ferris who used to run a mobile trauma rig on a colony patrol before the enlistment. He'll take you. Whatever happens up here, you're going with our people, not staying in a Directorate ward waiting for someone to decide you're not worth the ration. Tomas Vey tracked the light on the ceiling. "You probably can't hear me," Wren said. "That's all right. Somebody built you into a thing and used you up and put you here to be forgotten, and I'm not going to leave you to be forgotten, because if I leave you then, it was all just a better kind of the same thing." She put her hand near his, not touching on the white sheet. "My grandmother used to say you learn which way the weather moves so you can move first. She never said what you're supposed to do once you've moved. I think this is the part she didn't get to. You go back and you get the ones they left." She sat with him a while longer in the bright gold light of the ward, and then she went to find Skell and have an order cut for a med muster on the 9th day. And Skell cut it because he was afraid of her, and one more piece of the plan slid quietly into place beneath the notice of a prefect who was counting all the wrong things. Raven did not sleep the night before the deployment. He sat in his surgical suite with the throat images turning slowly on the wall, and he made his own preparations, which were small and terrible in their smallness. He drew the ward's sedative schedule and canceled it 3 days out, so that on the 9th day the patient in bed 6 would be awake and movable. He logged a med muster order that had come down from the asset's handler, and he approved the auxiliary staging on the medical tier, and he wrote in the justification field the flat, true-sounding words the Directorate liked: casualty intake, forward staging, efficiency. He set the study cell access to release on the medical tier's local authority during the operation window, and he told himself it was for casualty triage, and he knew it was so that a small gray-green creature that grew shelters would not be locked in a cell if the station came apart. He did not know the whole of the girl's plan. He had asked not to. But he had built, quietly, in the 2 days he had, a floor under whatever she was going to do, a way for the auxiliaries to be off the crawlers, a way for the spent boy to be moved, a way for the prisoner to be freed, so that when she moved, the people who could not move themselves would already be where they needed to be. Near the end of the dimmed cycle, he stood at the port and looked down at the world, and he thought about the prefect's promise. If it does not come down, you will have a bed in your own ward. He thought about the fact that, one way or another, the south face of the holdfast was not going to come down, because he had seen the girl's face in the hangar when she looked at the ancient wall, and he knew now what she was, or knew enough. And he understood that when the 9th day ended, whatever else was true, Ilving Korud was going to come looking for the man who built the instrument, and there would be no story about frames that could save him. He found that he did not mind as much as he had expected to. He had spent his career telling himself that building the instrument was the honest part, that where it played was someone else's charter, that a xenosurgeon's hands are clean if the hands that aim the instrument are not his. He had believed it through Tomas Vey, and half believed it through 4-plate tests, and stopped believing it entirely somewhere between the occupancy estimate and the small creature that said we grow walls. It is the only thing our kind has ever done against the dark. A man does not get to keep clean hands by handing the instrument to someone worse. He had learned that too late to matter and just in time to act on it, and those were not the same thing, and he would take the second one, since the first was gone. He powered down the throat images. He straightened the suite, And when the station's cycle brightened toward the 9th day and the light came gold through the dome, Adept Sol Raven went down to the assault bay to prepare the instrument for deployment, exactly as ordered, one last time. The assault bay was loud with the 9th day. 9 crawlers stood in a row under the bright bay lights, hatches open, and the assault companies loaded into them in the ordered chaos of soldiers who have drilled a thing so many times they have stopped believing it will ever be real. Raven came down through the noise with the girl beside him and 2 Draloth security officers a pace behind, and he felt the prefects tightening in every checkpoint, every logged glance, every drone that turned to track them as they crossed the deck to the lead crawler. Ren walked calm through all of it. She wore a conquered auxiliaries under harness and nothing else that marked her, no armor, no weapon, because she was the weapon. And she looked at the loading companies with the same flat attention she gave everything. And Raven, walking beside her, saw what she was counting. The auxiliaries. She was counting the auxiliaries, and there were almost none. The 2nd and 3rd crawlers, which the plan had loading with the conscript troops, the human orderlies, the small folk press gangs, the border species who had signed their own protective enlistments, stood half empty, and a conquered line sergeant was arguing with a loadmaster about it, and the loadmaster was holding up a slate and saying the word muster, and the sergeant was swearing. And the crawlers were going down short-handed because 41 auxiliaries had reported to a med muster on the medical tier instead. Raven saw the girl's eyes pass over the half-empty crawlers, and he saw nothing change in her face, and he understood that this was what victory looked like on her. Not relief, just the quiet checking of a box. Asset to the lead crawler, one of the security officers said. They put her in the lead crawler, at the front, in the gunner's position they had rebuilt into a speaker's port. Raven climbed up after her, on the pretext of a final check of the instrument, and inside the low-armored dark, he ran his hands over the port frame and the seals and pretended to inspect them while the girl settled onto the seat behind the port. "The auxiliaries are off the crawlers," he said, very low under the noise of the bay. "I know," Ren said. "The boy is moved. The prisoner's cell releases to the tier at the operation window. The ward is awake." He kept his hands moving on the frame, a surgeon checking his work. "Whatever you are going to do, the ones who cannot move themselves are where they need to be. That is the whole of what I could build you." "It is not much." Ren looked at him in the dark of the crawler, and for the first time since he had met her, something in her flat, calm face softened, just slightly, just at the edges. "It's the wall under the wall, Adept," she said. "It's everything." She looked forward through the port at the bay ramp and the pale gold light beyond it. "Get out of the crawler now. When this goes, you don't want to be logged inside it." Ren, he did not move. "The prefect is going to come for the man who built the instrument. I have staked my standing on a story about frames and he does not believe it. When the south face does not come down, then be somewhere else when it doesn't," she said. "The medical tier, with our people. Cut yourself into the med muster, Adept. Be a doctor on a deck full of casualties nobody's looking at, instead of the surgeon who built the thing that didn't do what it was told." She met his eyes. "You built a floor under me. Now stand on it. Go be where the ones who can't move themselves are, and when it's over, we'll need a doctor there more than we'll need one anywhere else." Raven looked at her a moment longer. Then he finished his false inspection and climbed down out of the crawler, and did not go back to the planning tier where the prefect expected him. He went, instead, down through the gold light to the medical tier, and reported himself for casualty staging, and folded his 4 hands into the crowd of frightened auxiliaries waiting for a wave that was never coming back the way anyone thought. The crawlers went down. Ren felt the drop in her stomach, the long fall from the colonnade's bay through the upper dark and into the weather of the world, the hull shuddering as it bit atmosphere, the light through the port going from the pale gold of the station to the harder, brighter gold of Severin's actual sky. She sat at the port with her hands loose in her lap, and she breathed, slow and even, and she felt the coal in her throat, banked and warm and aching, and she took the measure of it one more time. One effort, maybe two. Then a long cost. Make it the thing that matters, the doctor had said. She intended to. Around her the lead crawler's crew rode in tense silence. 4 conquered regulars and a Dreyloth section officer who kept glancing at her the way the whole station glanced at her, with the particular unease of people escorting a thing they have decided is dangerous and cannot quite believe they command. The section officer had a calm bead in his ear and a tactical slate on his knee, and on the slate Wren could see, upside down, the approach. 9 crawler icons descending toward the river valley, and the holdfast at the center of it, ringed gray, annotated, occupancy 9,000 and change. 2 minutes to the marked position, the section officer said. Range 100 meters south face, asset. He looked at her. You break the face on the prefect's mark relayed through me. Not before, you understand the sequence. I understand the sequence, Wren said. She did. She had understood it for days. The sequence was, the crawlers stop, she breaks the wall, the assault pours through the breach into 9,000 soft bodies, and a counselor 3 systems away puts his name to a 2-year war ended in an afternoon. That was the conquered sequence. It was clear and it was clean, and every alien on this operation understood it perfectly, because it was a sequence built by people who understood weapons. They did not understand her. They had never once walked around to the far side of the door. The crawler slowed. Through the port the ground came up. A river valley under the hard gold light, green banks and gray water, and rising from the near flank of it the holdfast, and Wren saw it whole for the first time, not on a table but real, and it stopped the breath in her for a moment despite everything. It was enormous. It was old. The gray shellwork rose in layered ridges out of the earth like something the world itself had grown, 40 layers, 50, each one a generation. The oldest sunk 200 years deep into the valley floor, and it did not look like a strongpoint or a nest or a resistance. It looked like exactly what the small creature in the study cell had said it was. A wall. The only thing a soft-bodied people had ever built against the dark. And behind it, invisible, 9,000 of them. The soft-shelled young, the brittle old, the ones who tended and grew and mended, all of them trusting 200 years of grown armor to hold one more day the way it had held every day before. The crawler stopped. Marked position, the section officer said into his bead. Lead crawler holding at 100 meters south face, awaiting the mark. He looked at Wren and reached over and unsealed the firing port in front of her so that the hard gold light of the world came in through the opening and lay across her face, and the ancient wall stood 100 meters off, filling the port, gray and ridged and waiting. Get ready, asset. It won't be long. Wren leaned toward the open port. She looked at the wall, the real wall, the 200-year wall, the wall she could bring down and knew she could bring down. And she felt the whole station and the whole operation and the whole cold arithmetic of the conquered waiting on the mark that would tell her to open it. She thought about the crack in the hangar that had healed. She thought about the small creature that grew shelters instead of weapons. She thought about her grandmother on a colony that no longer existed in a language the conquered had never bothered to learn. You learn which way the weather moves so you can move first. She was going to move first. But not on the wall. On the planning tier of the colonnade, in the pale gold light beneath the dome, Ilving Korud stood over the tactical table and watched 9 crawler icons hold at the marked position. And he was, for the first time in 9 days, entirely content. The counselor was present again, glowing on his relay pillar. The 2 fleet officers stood at the table. The modeled assessor hovered at the prefect's shoulder, 4 eyes on the feed. On the great display the holdfast turned slowly, ringed gray, and the lead crawler's icon pulsed at 100 meters from the south face, and inside that icon was an instrument that Ilving Korud had built his standing on. Lead crawler at marked position, a controller reported. Port open, asset in position. Awaiting the mark. The Directorate, Korud said, for the record, for the counselor, for the whole watching border, has been chartered to end the Severan resistance. In 2 years, 3 assault companies and every conventional method available to this Concord failed to breach the shellwork. Today, an asset of this Directorate's own making will breach it in a single word, and the resistance will end, and every strongpoint on this border will learn that grown armor is no shelter against a Ferax-class instrument that has been properly aimed. He looked at the counselor's projection. With the council's leave, I give the mark. Give it, the counselor said. Ilving Korud leaned to the channel. He had waited 11 months less than his charter allowed. He had built an instrument and calibrated it and managed its temperament and handled its conscience-ridden surgeon and brought it 100 meters from a wall that 2 years of soldiers could not scratch. And now he was going to speak a single word and win. Asset, he said into the channel in exactly the mild, even voice he used for everything. Break the wall. 100 meters from the south face, in the open port of the lead crawler, Wren Calloway heard the mark come through the section officer's bead and watched him nod at her. And she breathed in slow and deep, and all the way to the bottom, the way she liked to, the way she had been told not to, finishing the breath, and she turned her head, and she did not face the wall. She faced the crawlers. She faced the crawlers, and she made the sound. It was not aimed at the wall. It went the other way, back down the line of 9 armored machines drawn up in the river valley, with their hatches sealing and their companies loaded, and their weapons run out toward a holdfast full of soft-bodied creatures who could not fight. And it struck them the way it had struck the plates in the bright chamber 2 decks up, and the plates had never stood a chance, and neither did the crawlers. The section officer beside her had time to say one word. It was not a command. It was the beginning of a question, and the question was never finished, because the low, even note went through the lead crawler's hull, and the hull did what conquered line armor did when Wren Calloway finished her breath. It crazed. The ceramic-laced alloy webbed white from the open port outward, edge to edge, and then it stopped being a hull, and the crawler came apart around her like a shell around a hatched thing, the plates dropping away, the ports and hatches falling out of their frames, the whole armored machine unmaking itself into a heap of gray fragments in the valley grass, and standing up out of the wreck of it, unhurt, was the girl. She had broken the machine and not the people in it. That was the thing the Tier would spend a long time failing to understand. The crew tumbled out of the collapsing hull onto the grass alive, their armor gone, their weapons crazed useless in their hands, and Wren Calloway stepped down out of the ruin of the lead crawler onto the soil of a world she had never walked, and she was already breathing in again. The second note took the assault line. On the planning tier, the tactical display lost the lead crawler's icon, and Ilving Korud's first thought was that the instrument had failed catastrophically, that the throat had come apart the way he had always privately feared it might, that the girl had burned through on the first effort and taken her own crawler with her. Then the feed steadied, and he saw her standing in the wreckage, and he saw the assault line, and his second thought had no words in it at all. "What is she doing?" the counselor said. Its smooth, cool voice had a new thing in it, small and sharp. "Prefect, what is the asset doing?" Korud did not answer, because he was watching the second crawler come apart. It happened on the feed without sound, which made it worse. The great armored machine simply losing its skin, the plates webbing white and falling, the company inside spilling out onto the grass, the run-out lance breaking off at the mount and dropping in 2 pieces. And the girl walked. That was the part Korud's mind kept refusing. She walked down the line, unhurried, and every few steps she stopped and breathed and made the sound the feed could not carry. And another crawler died. Not the people, the machine, the armor, the weapons. Only ever the armor and the weapons. And the great assault that was to have ended a 2-year war in an afternoon came apart into a scatter of unarmored soldiers standing bewildered in a river valley with nothing in their hands that still worked. "She's turned it on the assault," one of the fleet officers said, in the flat voice of a man reporting his own disaster. "She's disarming the assault." "That is not possible," the assessor said. Its 4 eyes had not left the feed. The instrument was calibrated against fixed plate. "It has no fire discipline, no targeting. It is walking," the fleet officer said. "Look at it, it is choosing." And it was. Korad saw it and could not unsee it. The girl was not spraying the valley with sound like a broken weapon. She was walking the line, machine by machine, and each time she stopped she took the armor and the guns and left the soldiers standing, and there was nothing random in it, and nothing panicked and nothing angry. It was the most disciplined thing Ilving Korad had ever watched, and it was undoing his war one crawler at a time, and he understood, with a cold that started in his chest and spread outward, that he had never once known what the instrument was. He had known what it did to plates. He had built a projection on top of that, and a charter on top of the projection, and a counselor's confidence on top of the charter. And underneath all of it the instrument had been a person. And a person the whole time had been walking around to the far side of the door he had built and deciding what she was. "Fire on her," Korad said into the channel. His voice was still mild. It was the only thing about him that still worked the way it was supposed to. "All companies, the asset has gone rogue. Fire on the asset." They tried. Wren heard the order relayed across the valley through a dozen comm beads, thin and tinny, all of them saying some version of the same word, and she saw the soldiers nearest her raise what they still had, sidearms, the small weapons that had not been in their hands when she took the crawlers, the personal arms carried on the body instead of racked on the machine. She broke those too. She did not have to think about it much. A sidearm was armor and mechanism, the same as a crawler, only smaller and smaller things came apart easier. She breathed and made the note, low and short, and the weapons crazed white in the soldiers' hands and fell apart into fragments, and the soldiers stared at their empty hands, and she walked on. She did not touch the soldiers. She had decided, days ago in her quarters with her hand at her throat, that she was not going to touch the soldiers. Most of them were conscripts and press gangs and enlistees who had signed the same protective lie she had. The ones who were not were still just aliens doing what aliens had told them to do, and killing them would have made her the key after all. The thing that opened the way for slaughter only pointed the other direction. She was not the key. She was the wall. A wall does not kill the thing that comes against it. It only refuses to let it through. So she walked the line, and she took the armor and the weapons and left the soldiers, and the great conquered assault stood disarmed and bewildered in the river valley under the hard gold light. And behind her, the ancient gray wall of the holdfast stood exactly as it had stood for 200 years, untouched. Not one layer of it cracked, because the girl the conquered had built to break it had turned around and broken everything else instead. Her throat was on fire now. She felt it with every note. The coal in her neck no longer banked but open, burning, the grafted lattice drawing on her the way the doctor had warned it would, the way it had drawn on Thomas Vey until there was nothing left of him but a young man tracking the light. Each crawler cost her more than the last. Her legs were unsteady. There was a taste of copper at the back of her mouth. She had perhaps one full effort left. The doctor had said maybe 2, and she had spent the 2, and she was still walking, still breathing, still finishing the sentence, because there were 3 crawlers left at the far end of the line, and their companies were the ones with the heavy lances, the ones meant to pour through the breach. And if she stopped now with 3 crawlers still armored, then the assault could still reform and still fire on the wall and still do to the holdfast what she had turned around to prevent. So she did not stop. She walked toward the 3 crawlers with copper in her mouth and fire in her throat, and she breathed in, and she finished the breath. On the tier, the counselor's projection had gone very still, and stillness in a Draloth noble was a thing Ilving Korad had learned, over a long career, to be afraid of. "You told me," the counselor said quietly, "that the asset was disciplined." "It was." You told me it was patient, that it waited well. That curiosity was not resistance. The smooth, cool voice did not rise, and that was worse. I put my standing on this operation because you assured me the instrument was aimed. I am now watching it disarm a conquered assault company by company in front of 2 fleet officers and an oversight relay, and it is not malfunctioning, Prefect. That is the part you cannot explain and I can see with my own eyes. A malfunction does not choose to leave the soldiers alive. That is not a broken weapon. That is a person your Directorate armed and did not understand, and I put my name beside yours on the record this morning. A pause, cold as the space between the stars the relay crossed. Get it back, whatever it costs. Because if that instrument walks off that field, and the story that reaches the other borders is that the conquered built a death welder to break a wall, and she turned around and broke the conquered instead, then it will not be the Severan resistance that learns a lesson today. It will be us. Korad looked at the feed, 3 crawlers left. The girl walking toward them, slower now, unsteady, one hand pressed to her own throat, and even at this remove through the flat lens of the tactical feed, he could see that she was hurting, that whatever she was doing was tearing something out of her to do it. She's failing, he said. Look at her, she's burning through. The instrument does not last, the boy in the ward is proof. She has 3 crawlers left and she cannot reach them. She will fall before she takes the last of the line, and the assault will reform, and this ends the way it was always going to end. He leaned to the channel, and for the first time in 9 days there was something under the mildness, something that was not quite panic and was closer to it than Ilving Korad had been in 20 years. Rear companies. Hold your armor. Do not advance, do not present, keep your crawlers sealed and let her burn herself out on them. She cannot break what she cannot reach. Wait her out. She is a candle and she is nearly gone. He was right about the candle. He was wrong, as he had been wrong about everything concerning the instrument from the first day, about which way it would gutter. One of the rear commanders did not obey the order to hold. Wren felt it before she saw it, a change in the shape of the sound the valley was making, a heavy servo whine cutting under the general confusion, and she turned her wrecked attention toward the far end of the line and saw the lead of the 3 rear crawlers break its own seal. Its hatch stayed shut, but its dorsal mount came alive, and the heavy lance rack there began to run out, swinging away from her, away from the disarmed companies, toward the one target that had been the point of the whole 9-day operation. The wall. She understood the commander's arithmetic even from 50 meters, even through the fire in her throat. He had heard the prefect order the rear to turtle and wait her out. He had watched the girl falter and sway and press her hand to her throat. And he had decided, out of ambition or zeal or the simple refusal of a soldier to sit sealed in his hull while a war he had bled 2 years for came apart around him, that if the assault could not pour through a breach, then he would make the breach himself now with the heavy lance before the faltering instrument could reach him. Complete the mission. Redeem the day. Bring the wall down after all. The lance finished running out and steadied on the ancient gray face of the holdfast, on the 9,000 behind it, and its charging note began to climb. Wren was out of breaths. She knew it the way you know the bottom of a well. 9 notes had torn something in her that would not knit, and the copper in her mouth was blood, and the lattice had drawn so deep that the edges of the world had gone bright and thin, and she had told herself 2 crawlers ago that she was finished, that Korad's order to turtle had won her the day, that she could stop. The lance charged toward its firing note, and she found one more breath. She did not know where it came from. Later she would not be able to say. She only knew that the wall was 200 years old and full of soft folk who grew shelters instead of weapons, and that a heavy lance was armor and mechanism the same as a crawler, only meaner, and that mean things came apart too if you finished the breath, and she was not going to stand in this valley and watch the one thing she had spent herself to prevent happen at the last because a single commander could not bear to lose. So she drew the breath all the way to the bottom, past the bottom, into whatever was left under the bottom, and she faced the heavy lance and she finished it. The note that came out of her was not the even sustained thing it had been. It cracked in the middle. It cost her a step, then another, her knees buckling even as she held it. But it crossed the 50 meters and struck the charging lance. And the lance, racked, charged, a heartbeat from firing on the wall, crazed white along its whole length and came apart on the mount, the charge venting harmlessly up into the hard gold sky in a wash of light that touched nothing, and the crawler under it slewed and stalled as its own weapon died on its back. Ren went down. Not all the way, not yet. Her knees hit the torn grass and the valley tilted and grayed at the edges, and for a long moment the world narrowed to a bright thin tunnel with the broken lance falling away from the whole gray wall at the far end of it. But she did not black out. She knelt in the wreckage with her hand at her throat and the copper filling her mouth, and she held on to the last of herself by her fingernails, because there was still one thing she needed to see before she let go, and she was not going to let go until she had seen it. Finished, the lance was down, the wall was whole. She knelt and breathed the ragged, empty breaths that had no notes left in them, and she waited to see what the last of the line would do. On the tier, Ilving Korud watched the last of it on a feed that would not stop showing him things he had refused to understand. He saw the rear commander break the order. He saw the heavy lance run out. He saw the girl, whom he had written off in his own mind as a spent candle a full minute before, find one more note and reach across 50 meters to break a charged lance off its mount an instant before it fired on the wall. And he saw her drop and not rise, and he understood that she had spent the very last of herself not to save her own life, not to escape, not to make a point, but to stop one zealous commander from putting a lance into a shelter full of civilians after the war was already lost. She was empty, the assessor said in its cool, rippling voice, 4 eyes on the feed. The strain readings were past collapse. She had nothing left, and she reached for the lance anyway. A pause. Prefect, I have spent my career measuring instruments. I want you to understand what I am about to put in the record, because I do not think you have grasped it even now. That was not an asset performing to specification. An asset performs while it can and stops when it cannot. That reached past the point where it could, one time, to protect a wall that was no longer its mission, and never was its ally, because it had decided that the wall mattered more than the instrument did. 4 eyes turned toward the prefect. You did not build a weapon that turned. You conscripted a person, gave her the strength to choose, and she chose this in front of 2 fleet officers and an oversight relay. That is what the border will hear, not that we were beaten. That we were refused, by the very thing we made, in favor of the people we sent it to destroy. Korud said nothing. On the feed the girl lay still in the torn grass, and the wall stood whole above her, and out of the wall the small folk were already coming toward her, and there was nothing left in the whole bright arithmetic of the tier that Ilving Korud could do about any of it. The last 2 rear crawlers sealed themselves and did not advance. Ren saw it happen from her knees, 50 meters off, swaying, the copper thick in her mouth. The 2 surviving machines pulling their hatches shut, running their weapons back in, hunkering down into their armor like animals that have decided, after watching the third one die reaching for the wall, that the safest thing left is to be still. And she understood, through the fire in her throat, that Korud had made the mistake she had been building toward for 9 days without ever letting him see the shape of it. He had told them to turtle, to hold their armor and wait her out. A crawler that will not advance cannot breach a wall. A company sealed in its hull and told to stay sealed is a company that is not pouring through any breach, because there is no breach, because the girl they built to make one had turned around and taken every machine that might have made it. The last 2 could sit in the valley until the world ended and the holdfast would stand, because the only thing that had ever threatened it was the assault, and the assault was standing disarmed and bewildered in the grass, and the last of it had just watched a heavy lance come apart mid-charge and decided to hide. She had not needed to break the last crawlers. She had needed them to stop, and Korra, trying to save them from her, had stopped them himself. Ren knelt in the river valley with the ruined assault spread around her and the ancient wall 100 meters off, and she pressed her hand to her throat, and she let herself, for one moment, feel how close to gone she was. The lattice had drawn deep. Something in her voice had torn. When she swallowed, there was blood in it. She did not know if she would ever sing again. The plain old soprano line, the thing her mother had and her grandmother before that, the thing that had taken her from a supply bay to a surgical suite to this valley. She thought distantly that she might have spent it all here, in 10 breaths, and that this was probably what her grandmother had meant about the part she never got to teach. You move first, and then you learn what moving cost. Beyond her, the ancient wall of the holdfast began, very slowly to open. Raven watched it on the medical tier, on a casualty staging feed that had never been meant to carry a battle crowded shoulder to shoulder with 40 frightened human auxiliaries, and one spent boy in a float chair, and a small gray-green creature that had been released from a study cell into the general confusion of an operation gone sideways. The Ostrani prisoner had refused to leave the feed. It stood pressed close to the display on its many folded limbs, its cluster of dark eyes fixed on the image of the great holdfast far below, and when the south face began to open it made a sound, low and modulated, that the tier's translator did not catch because no one had asked it to, and that Raven understood anyway, because there are sounds a person does not need translated. The wall opened, not breached, opened from the inside, the way a thing that grew a shelter around itself can also choose to unfold it. A seam ran down the ancient gray face and widened, layer by layer, 200 years of armor parting under its own control, and out of the opening into the hard gold light of their own valley came the Ostrani. They came slowly. They came soft and small and unarmed, the way they had lived behind the wall, the ones who tended and grew and mended, the soft-shelled young held close, the brittle old moving careful over the torn ground, and they came out to stand in the open before a disarmed, conquered assault and a girl who had turned her weapon around, and they did not attack, because attacking was not a thing they had ever learned to do. They simply came out and stood in their own light, and looked at the human who had refused to be the key. "They're coming out," one of the auxiliaries breathed. "Look at them, they're just coming out." Raven looked at them, 9,000 soft bodies emerging from behind 200 years of grown wall, and beside him the small gray-green creature that had said, "We grow walls. It is the only thing our kind has ever done against the dark," made its low, modulated sound. And Raven understood that in all his career in the Directorate, he had never once seen the far side of his own work until this moment. He had built instruments and handed them off and told himself the aiming was someone else's charter, and he had never seen the thing the instrument was aimed at come out from behind its wall and stand in the light, soft and small and alive, because it was not the key that came for it after all. He turned from the feed. There was a boy in a float chair beside him tracking the light on the tier's ceiling, and 40 auxiliaries who had walked off an assault, and a doctor's whole life to reckon with, and the reckoning could wait, because down on the tier there would be casualties soon, and a doctor was the one useful thing he still knew how to be. But he looked back once, at the girl standing small in the valley with her hand at her throat and the wall opening behind her, and he thought that he had built her to break their armor, and had not known, in all his careful work, that he was building the first thing in this whole arm of the border that would ever choose to be a shield. On the planning tier, Ilving Korra gave the order he had been holding in reserve for 9 days, and it was the last order of his career, though he did not yet know that. "Colonnade batteries," he said into the command channel. "The station's guns, range the valley. I want a fire solution on the holdfast in the field." The controller hesitated. "Prefect, our own companies are on that field, disarmed but alive." "And the asset?" The asset is a Directorate liability now, and the field is a record I will not have carried to the other borders. Korod's voice was mild and it did not waver. The counselor was clear. Whatever it costs, if the story that spreads is that a Deathworlder turned our own instrument against us and lived, then this Concord loses more than a valley. We erase the field, all of it, the holdfast, the asset, the companies. A clean solution and a clean record, and we report a resistance strongpoint destroyed with regrettable friendly losses, which is a story the border has heard 100 times and will believe. He straightened. Range the batteries. Belay that. The counselor's voice came smooth and cold across 3 systems of relay, and every officer on the tier went still. Prefect Korod, the counselor said, you will not range the station's guns on that field. Counselor, the record. I am the record. The projection turned its slate-purple face toward Korod, and there was nothing mild in it now. Listen to me very carefully, because you have spent 9 days not listening, and it has cost this Concord a valley and may yet cost it more. You want to erase the field to protect a story, but the field is already a story. 2 fleet officers watched it. An assessor watched it. I watched it. And 9,000 Ostrani just walked out of that holdfast into the open, alive, in front of a disarmed assault, because a human your Directorate built chose to shield them. That is the story now. It happened. It cannot be unhappened by shelling it, and if you shell it, if you kill 9,000 soft-bodied civilians and a company of our own disarmed soldiers to erase the memory of a girl who spared everyone, then the story that reaches the other borders is not that we are strong. It is that we are the kind of power that builds a child into a weapon, points her at a shelter, and burns the shelter and our own troops to ash when she refuses. That story does not frighten our enemies, Prefect. It recruits them. The projection held him. Stand down the batteries. Recall the assault. Withdraw from the valley. We are leaving Severin. Leaving? Korod's composure cracked, finally on the 9th day, in front of the officers and the assessor and the relay. Counselor, 2 years, 3 companies, my whole charter. Your charter is finished, and so, I think, are you, the counselor said without heat, the way one closes an account. You built an instrument you did not understand and staked my standing on it, and it turned in your hand, and now you want to burn a valley to hide the cut. No, we take the loss. We withdraw with what dignity is left, and we let the border believe the Severin operation was reassessed and concluded, which is a lie small enough to survive. And you will report to the oversight tier the moment your station returns to the Corps, to explain how a Directorate under your command built a Deathworlder, called her patient, and never once thought to ask what she would do when you handed her the strength to choose. The projection began to fade. Recall the assault, Prefect. That is the last order I will trouble to give you. The projection winked out. The tier was silent. Ilving Korod stood over a tactical display that showed a disarmed assault, an opened wall, 9,000 civilians in the light, and a girl swaying in the middle of it with her hand at her throat. And for the first time in his long career, he understood that he had never been the one holding the instrument. He had only ever been standing on the wrong side of the door. Recall the assault, he said quietly to no one, and the officers moved to obey, and the 9th day ended not with a wall coming down but with a fleet turning around. The last of Wren Calloway gave out somewhere in the space between the recall order and the silence that followed it. She had held on from her knees through the whole long minute of it, her hand at her throat, the world bright and thin at the edges the way it goes before you lose it, and she thought, with the flat clarity that had carried her through 9 days, not yet, not until it's finished. She counted the crawlers, 8 broken open, 2 sealed and holding, none advancing. She counted the soldiers, standing, disarmed, milling, none firing. She counted the wall, opening now whole, 200 years of it untouched, and out of it the small folk beginning to come, soft and slow into their own light. Finished, then, she let herself go down the rest of the way. She did not hit the ground. Many soft limbs caught her, cool, segmented, careful, a dozen of them cradling her weight before her face reached the grass. and she was lowered instead of dropped, laid back against something warm and living. And when the brightness cleared a little from her eyes, she was looking up into a cluster of dark eyes set in a pale gray-green face, and the face was making a sound, low and modulated, and she did not need it translated either. Around her the Ostrani had come. Not all 9,000, but the nearest of them, the ones who had emerged first, had crossed the torn ground to the girl kneeling in the middle of the wreckage, and they had gathered around her the way a body gathers around a wound to close it, and they held her up out of the dirt and made their low sounds. And Wren Calloway, who had not wept in 18 months on a conquered station, who had gone cold and quiet and patient through every underestimation, lay in the arms of the people she had refused to bury, and felt something in her chest come loose at last. She did not sob, she was too spent for that. But her eyes ran silently into the hard gold light, and one of the small folk reached up with a careful limb and touched the wet track on her face as though it were a thing they had never seen and wished to understand. And the sound they all made changed, softened, folded around her, and Wren let herself be held by 9,000 soft-bodied creatures who grew walls against the dark, and understood that she had become, for one day, in one valley, the wall they did not have to grow. "I'm not a key," she said, or tried to. Her voice came out wrecked, a ruin of the thing it had been, barely a whisper, blood in it. But the translator on the nearest small creature caught it anyway, and rendered it flat and clear into the Ostrani air, and the sound they made in answer went on for a long time. Raven came down with the second recovery shuttle, on the cover of Casualty Triage, and he did not go to the conquered wounded first. There were conquered wounded, soldiers hurt in the collapse of the crawlers, cuts and breaks, and the shock of men who had watched their armor unmake itself around them, and a Directorate xenosurgeon's place was among them, and he would get to them. But he came down out of the shuttle into the hard gold light of a world he had only ever seen through a dome, and he crossed the torn valley past the disarmed companies and the ruined machines, and he went to the place where the small folk had gathered, because that was where the girl was, and the girl was the patient he had come for. They let him through. He did not know why, perhaps because he came slowly, with his 4 hands open and empty, or perhaps because the girl, when she saw him, made a sound the translators caught and passed along, a wrecked whisper that meant something like "He built me, and he is not one of them." The small folk parted, and Raven knelt in the grass beside Wren Calloway, and he looked at what 9 breaths had done to her. It was bad. He had known it would be. He was a xenosurgeon, and he had built the lattice himself, and he could read the damage in the strain of her breathing and the blood at the corner of her mouth, and the ruin of the whisper that was all that remained of the voice that had broken a war. The instrument had drawn on her the way it had drawn on Thomas Vey, deep and hungry, and she had let it, spent it, poured 9 days of it into 9 breaths in a single afternoon, and there would be a cost that no surgery could fully take back. "You should not have finished the breath," he said, quietly kneeling over her. "Every time I told you, you should have stopped at threshold." "It's steadier if I finish it," Wren whispered, and something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her wrecked mouth. "You knew I'd say that." "I knew you'd say that." Raven's 4 hands moved over her, careful reading, doing what a doctor's hands do when the rest of him is breaking. "Your voice, Wren. The thing itself, not the lattice. The thing that was yours before we ever touched you. I don't know if it comes back. I don't know if you'll sing again. I need you to know that before you decide how you feel about what you did today." Wren looked up at him, at the 4-armed doctor with the careful hands who had built her and warned her, and stood on the floor she asked him to stand on, and her wrecked whisper, when it came, was steady. "I decided how I felt about it in my quarters 9 days ago with my hand on my throat," she said. "They gave me a voice that could break armor. I always knew what I'd do with a voice." Her eyes went past him, to the 9,000 standing in their own light, to the whole and open and untouched wall. "My grandmother sang. My mother sang. I sang because they sang, and it never once occurred to any of us that a voice was for breaking things. It was for being heard. The whisper caught and held. If the cost of being heard the one time it mattered is that I don't get the small times back, then I'll pay it. I was never going to be their key, adept. I'd rather be a wall with no voice than a weapon with a beautiful one. Raven knelt in the grass and had no answer for that, because there was no answer to it, because she had said the whole of it and there was nothing a doctor could add. So he did the thing he did know how to do. He straightened her against the small folk who held her, and he checked her breathing, and he began, methodically, to keep her alive, which was the honest part of his work and always had been, and which he understood now. He had spent his whole career mistaking for the same thing as building the instrument. They were not the same thing. He had learned it too late to matter and just in time to act on it. He took the second one. The colonnade withdrew from Severin over the following 3 days, and it withdrew the way large institutions do everything, slowly, bloodlessly, with a great deal of paper. The official record, when it was written, said that the Severin operation had been reassessed at the council level and concluded that the strongpoint had been contained by other means, that friendly losses were regrettable but limited. It was a lie small enough to survive, exactly as the counselor had promised, and it went out to the other borders and was believed by the people who wanted to believe it and disbelieved quietly by the people who had heard the other version, which spread the way the true version always spreads, in low voices, from auxiliary to auxiliary, from border to border, growing as it went. The version that spread was not about a fleet, it was about a girl. It said that the Settery conquered had taken a death worlder and rebuilt her throat into a weapon meant to break a shelter full of soft-bodied civilians, and that on the day they aimed her at the wall, she had turned around and broken the assault instead, machine by machine, and left every soldier alive, and stood in the valley while 9,000 who were meant to die walked out into the light. It said the conquered had built a key and gotten a wall. It said the deadliest thing the galaxy's top predators had turned out to be was not their appetite for breaking things but their refusal, when it came down to it, to break the ones who could not fight back. That was the story that frightened the conquered, and the counselor had been right to be frightened of it, because it did not make the border tremble at humanity's strength. It made the border wonder whether humanity might be the kind of neighbor worth having, and there is nothing a predatory institution fears more than a monster the smaller folk begin to trust. Ilving Korud did not withdraw with his station. He was recalled ahead of it, summoned to the oversight tier the moment the colonnade uncoupled from Severin orbit, and Raven saw him once more before he went, in the station's bright cord center, under the dome, being walked to a courier by 2 officers who were no longer his. The prefect had aged in 3 days. The mildness was still on him, but it had gone hollow, a habit worn over nothing, and when his cold, bright eyes found Raven across the concourse they held for a moment, and there was no threat left in them, only the confusion of a man who had counted every ledger except the one that mattered. "You knew," Korud said when they drew level. It was not an accusation. He had no standing left to accuse. In the hangar, when she cracked the wall and let it heal, you knew what she was doing. "I suspected," Raven said. "You told me it was the frame. I told you a true-sounding thing so that you would bring her in close," Raven said, "because she wanted to be close, and I had decided by then to give her what she wanted instead of what you wanted. I built the instrument, Prefect. You were right about that, but you were wrong about the only thing that mattered, which is that building the instrument was never the same as owning it. You never once asked her what she would do. You called her patient and disciplined and an asset, and you meant a thing that waits for a mark. She was waiting for a mark. It was just never going to be yours." Korud looked at him for a long moment, and then the officers moved him on toward the courier, and the last thing Ilving Korud said, as the man who had ended his charter watched him go, was not to Raven at all. It was to himself, quietly, in the tone he used for everything. "I should have walked around the door," he said, and then he was gone, and the courier took him to a reckoning of his own, An adept soul, Raven stood alone in the bright center of a station that was leaving Severin behind, and felt no satisfaction, and was glad of it, because satisfaction would have meant he had learned nothing. The Conquered did not try to reclaim the girl. That surprised the auxiliaries, who had spent 18 months learning that the Conquered reclaimed everything: scrip, equipment, bodies in bags they were not allowed to open. But it did not surprise Raven, because he had understood the counselor's arithmetic in the moment the batteries were stood down. A power that has just been publicly refused by its own weapon does not send a courier to demand the weapon back. That is a second story, worse than the first, and the counselor had spent the withdrawal doing nothing but managing stories. So the deal, when it came cold and quiet and dressed as a mercy. A Directorate clerk, a four-eyed cephalopod elite who had watched the whole thing from the tier and never once been asked her opinion, came down to Severin on the third day with a sealed instrument of release, and she found Raven in the field hospital the Ostrani had helped the humans raise at the foot of the opened wall, and she read the instrument to him in the toneless voice of the record. The human auxiliaries seconded to the colonnade under the protective enlistment, the instrument said, were, effective immediately, released from their obligations, the enlistment on this border having been reassessed and concluded. The individual designated in Directorate records as the augmented asset was, the instrument said, written off, a total loss, damaged beyond operational value, no reclamation warranted. The Ostrani holdfast at Severin was, the instrument said, no longer designated a strong point of interest, the operation against it having been reassessed and concluded. Reassessed and concluded. Raven had come to understand that this was the phrase the Conquered used when it had lost and needed the losing to sound like a decision. The asset is written off, the clerk finished, folding the instrument closed. The Directorate has no further interest in her. She is, per the record, of no value. Four Eyes considered him. Between us, adept, off the record, that is the most valuable a person has ever been. To be written off by the Conquered as worthless is the only freedom this institution has ever granted anyone. She bought it in 9 breaths. I have watched assets for 20 years and I have never seen one buy it at all. The clerk turned to go and paused. The record will also note that the augmenting surgeon requested transfer to a border medical mission and was granted it, his services being no longer required by a concluded Directorate. In case you were wondering whether the door was open. And she was gone, back up to the station, back to the Corps, carrying the cold, clean lie that let everyone keep their standing. Raven stood in the field hospital with the door open behind him, and understood that he had just been given, in the guise of a bureaucratic write-off, the thing he had not known how to ask for. The 41 released auxiliaries had a choice to make, and they made it in the field hospital at the foot of the wall, on the evening of the third day, with Odell doing most of the talking. The Conquered would carry any of them who wanted to go, the release said, back toward the Corps, toward the border transit hubs, toward whatever passed for home after 18 months of protective enlistment. Some wanted to go. A porter with children on a colony 3 systems back wanted to go, and no one thought less of him for it, and the small folk grew him a case of clean water and dried valley fruit for the journey without being asked. A handful of others went with him. No one counted it a betrayal. They had all signed the same lie and paid it in the same scrip, and going home was its own hard road. But most of them stayed. They stayed because there was a field hospital to run and a girl in a grown chamber who had spent her voice for people she had never met, and because the small folk, who had spent 200 years growing walls against a hard world, did not know the first thing about setting a broken limb or cleaning a burn, and 40 humans who had carried supplies and minded wounded and dug latrines for the Conquered turned out to be exactly the thing a soft people opening their wall to the light most needed. Odell put it plainly, the way he put everything. They released us, he said, standing in the grown chamber with the valley light coming gold through the grown apertures. Wrote us off, no value. Well, He looked around at the small folk moving in their quiet, many-limbed way, tending and mending, and at the human medics already unpacking what the field hospital had. I've been of no value to somebody my whole life. First time it ever came with an open door and a place worth staying. He shrugged his broad shoulders. My cousin went down on an assault and came back in a bag. I'm not going down on anybody's assault again, but I'll stay and mend the ones who do. That's different. That I can do the rest of my life and sleep at night. They stayed, most of them, and the field hospital became a thing that lasted, and the small folk grew chambers for the humans alongside their own, and 18 months of protective enlistment turned, quietly, over the following seasons, into the first place on that border where humans and the folk they had refused to bury lived inside the same wall by choice. It was not a treaty. No council signed it. It was smaller and more durable than a treaty. It was 40 people deciding to stay, and a soft folk making room, and a wall growing a little wider one generation at a time. Wren woke on the 4th day in a chamber grown of gray shellwork, and the first thing she understood was that she was inside the wall. Not a strongpoint, not a nest, a home, the interior of the great holdfast, layered and ridged and warm, the light coming soft and gold through grown apertures high in the curved walls, and everywhere the small folk moving in their quiet many-limbed way, tending and growing and mending, exactly as the prisoner in the study cell had said. She lay on a woven pallet in a chamber that smelled of clean water and something green, and her throat was a banked ruin, and when she tried to speak nothing came but a wrecked thread of sound, and she lay still and took the measure of what remained. Raven was there. He was always there, it seemed, over the days that followed. The four-armed doctor moving between the human field hospital at the foot of the wall and the grown chamber where the small folk had insisted on keeping the girl, tending her throat with the careful hands that had built it, saying little, because there was little to say, and both of them preferred it that way. "Can you hear this?" he asked her on the 5th day, and hummed a low, even note, a doctor's test, watching her face. Wren heard it. She heard it in her back teeth and the small bones of her ears, the way she had always heard everything since the surgical suite, the lattice still there, still listening. And she opened her mouth to answer him and found the wrecked thread of her voice, and she pushed a little sound out along it, careful, testing, not the war note, nothing that could break so much as a cup, just a plain, small human sound, the beginning of a line she had sung her whole life. It cracked, it failed halfway, but it was there. "It's there," Raven said, and something moved in his careful face. "Wren, it's damaged and it may always be, and you may never break another plate as long as you live, but the thing that was yours before we touched you, it's there. Small, cracked, but there." Wren lay in the warm, grown dark of a wall she had refused to break, and pushed the small cracked sound out along the ruin of her voice, and let it fail, and pushed it out again, and did not stop, because a voice is not for breaking things. It never had been. It was for being heard, and she meant to be heard for a long time yet, in whatever cracked and human register they had left her. And if it took the rest of her life to coax the line back up out of the ruin, then that was a cost she had decided about 9 days ago with her hand on her throat, and she did not regret it, and she would not. They moved Thomas Vey down to the holdfast in the 2nd week, because the doctor asked, and the small folk did not know how to refuse a request made on behalf of the person who had shielded them. Raven had a theory, and the theory was thin, and he said so plainly to the humans who asked. The Directorate had never studied whether a spent augment could recover, because the Directorate wrote off spent augments the way it had written off Wren, as total losses of no operational value. It had never occurred to anyone in the Charter that a thing drawn down to nothing might, given time and rest and no further demands, draw itself back up. Raven did not know if it was true. But he had a boy who tracked the light and did not know his name, and he had, for the first time in his career, no charter telling him to stop, and so he brought Thomas Vey into the warm, grown quiet of the holdfast, and he began, patiently, to find out. It came back slowly when it came. A month in, Tomas Vey turned his head to a sound instead of the light. 2 months in, he answered to his name. Not every time, not reliably, but sometimes. A flicker behind the eyes, a young man surfacing from very far down. Raven wrote none of it in a Directorate record, because there was no Directorate record anymore. Only his own notes, kept in his own hand, in the warm dark of a wall, on the question of whether a thing that has been used up can be given back to itself. He did not know the answer yet. He thought he might spend the rest of his life on it, and he found, to his own quiet surprise, that this was exactly the work he wanted, and that he had spent his whole career building instruments when the thing he was for, the honest part, the part with clean hands, had been this all along. Not the making of the weapon, but the mending of the person the weapon had been made from. Ren sat with Tomas often in those first months. The two spent instruments of the Directorate keeping each other company in the grown dark. She could not sing to him, not yet, maybe not ever, but she could push the small cracked thread of a line out along her ruined voice, and she did. And sometimes the young man in the float chair turned his head to it, and once in the 3rd month he hummed back. Just a few notes, off and cracked and human, and Ren Calloway, who had turned a war around and asked for nothing, closed her eyes in the warm dark and counted it among the few things she had ever done that she was sure had been worth the cost. A year after the 9th day, the balance on the border had moved, and everyone who watched borders for a living understood that it had moved because of one valley. The conquered did not return to Severin. It could not, without reopening the story it had spent a year burying, and so the great gray holdfast stood untouched, and its people came and went in the open for the first time in 200 years, and the small folk of 3 neighboring worlds, hearing what had happened, sent quiet delegations to the opened wall to see for themselves whether it was true. It was true. There was a human living inside the holdfast. They were told, the singer who had turned the weapon around, and she could not break a cup any more, and she would not have broken one if she could. That was the part the delegations could not stop turning over. Not that a Deathworlder had been strong enough to end a war in an afternoon. They had always assumed the Deathworlders were strong. The whole galaxy assumed it, filed it, feared it in the abstract. The part that moved along the border in low voices was that the strong thing, handed the power to break a shelter, had chosen to be the shelter, had spent her own voice down to a ruin to make sure the soft folk lived, and asked for nothing and stayed. Humanity's standing did not rise on that story the way strength makes a thing rise. It rose the way trust rises, slowly, among people who have been burned before and are very careful now about whom they let near their walls. And that, Raven thought, watching the delegations come and go, was a far more dangerous thing to a power like the Conquered than any fleet, because a fleet can be answered with a fleet, and there is no fleet that answers a neighbor the smaller folk have decided to trust. There were smaller consequences too, the kind that never reached a record. 2 systems inward, a holdfast that had spent a season under Conquered pressure of its own, found that the pressure had quietly lifted. No assault, no ultimatum, just a survey fleet that came and looked, and reasoned that a wall which might have a human behind it was a wall best left alone. The Farax program itself was never formally ended. It did not need to be. A cohort was screened the following cycle, and advanced no one, and the cycle after that the screening was suspended pending review, and the review was never scheduled, because there was no version of the program's own paperwork that could explain how you built a key and got a shield, and an institution that cannot model an outcome learns in the end to stop reaching for it. The delegation that came in the 13th month was different, and Ren knew it was different before it finished crossing the valley, because it did not come to the Ostreni. It came to her. They were tall and armored, and their armor was very fine. A border power Raven named quietly as the VASHTU Reach, a rival of the Conquereds, one of the powers the withdrawal had left room for. They came under a flag of parley, and they were received with the careful courtesy the Ostrani gave everyone now. And they asked, politely, to speak with the human. And Wren met them at the foot of the opened wall in the hard gold light, small and plain and ruin-voiced, with Raven a pace behind her and Odell a pace behind him. Their spokesman was courteous. He was more than courteous. He was kind, and the kindness was the sharpest thing about him. "We have heard the story," he said. "All of it, the true version, not the Concord's paper. We know what they built you to do, and we know what you did instead. We admire it." He inclined his fine armored head. "We have also heard that it cost you. That the surgery that gave you the voice is spent, that the thing that was yours is damaged, that you cannot do again what you did in this valley. And we have come to make you an offer because we think a person who did what you did deserves better than to be written off as a total loss." He spread his hands. "Come to the reach. Our physicians are the equal of any in this arm of the border. We can rebuild what the Concord built. Better. We can give you back the voice, both voices, the one that sings and the one that breaks, and we can give you a place of honor and standing and the power to protect not one holdfast but 100. You would never again be a written-off asset in someone's record. You would be the Reach's shield, named, honored, whole." His voice was very gentle. "You spent yourself for these people, and they cannot even give you back your song. We can. Come with us and be terrible again in a good cause this time. Ours." It was, Wren understood, the real test. Not the wall. Not the assault. This. A kind man offering to make her whole and make her a weapon in the same breath, for a cause that was, this time, genuinely better than the one she had refused, and asking her to believe that the difference between a good weapon and a bad one lived in the cause and not in the thing itself. She had learned better than that a long time ago, on a colony that no longer existed, in a language the Concord had never translated. "No," Wren said. Her voice was a wrecked thread and it did not carry, so Raven's translator caught it and passed it clear into the valley, and the tall, fine spokesman blinked. "You have not considered." "I considered it before you finished asking." Wren looked up at him, plain and calm, the way she had looked at everything her whole life. "You're kind, you mean it, and you're offering me exactly what the Concord offered me, dressed better. They said the enhancement was for my protection. You're saying it's for a good cause. It's the same offer. Give me back the voice that breaks and point me at the right enemies this time." She shook her head once. "There is no right enemy for that voice. I found that out in this valley. The moment I let someone give it back to me so I can point it at their enemies, I'm the key again, a better key, an honored key, a key that gets its song back, but a key. And I told the Concord, and I'll tell you, because it's the only thing I've ever been sure of." The thread of her voice held, cracked and steady. "I'd rather be a wall with a ruined voice than a weapon with a beautiful one. You can't offer me anything that changes that, because the thing you're offering to give back is the exact thing I spent on purpose to be free of. I'm not for sale as a shield any more than I was for sale as a sword. I'm not for sale." The spokesman was quiet for a long moment. Then, to his credit, and Wren filed it, the way she filed everything. He inclined his fine head, not in defeat but in something closer to respect, and he did not ask again. "Then the Reach will remember," he said, "that it was told no by the one person in this arm of the border who had the most reason to say yes. That is its own kind of answer, perhaps the more useful one." He gathered his delegation. "If you ever change your mind, the offer stands. If you never do, which I begin to think is likelier, then know that you have taught a border power something today that it did not expect to learn from a written-off asset in a grown wall." He paused. "What is it worth? A voice that could have been terrible and chose to be quiet. We will be a long time working that out." He crossed the valley and was gone, and Wren stood at the foot of the wall in the gold light and let out a breath that had no note in it at all, and beside her Raven said, quietly, "You could have had your song back." "I have my song back," Wren said. She pushed the small cracked thread of a line out along her ruined voice, a few notes off and human, the beginning of something her grandmother used to sing. It failed halfway, the way it always failed now. She smiled, small. It's just cracked. Cracked is mine. Whole would have been theirs. Raven stayed. He had been given the open door, the write-off, the transfer, the concluded directorate that no longer required his services, and he used it not to go back to the Corps and the surgical suites and the charter, but to stay in the warm grown dark of a wall at the edge of the border, tending spent instruments and studying whether they could be given back to themselves. He was not a young man, by the reckoning of his people, and he had spent most of his years building weapons for an institution that wrote off the people it built them from, and he had perhaps expected to spend the rest of them the same way, quietly, cleanly, telling himself the aiming was someone else's charter. Instead, he spent them in a holdfast, with a girl whose voice he had ruined and helped to save, and a boy he had used up and was slowly giving back, and 9,000 soft-bodied creatures who had learned to trust one human enough to trust, cautiously, a second. And he found that the work of mending was harder than the work of building, and slower, and far less certain of success, and that he would not have traded a day of it for his whole career on the other side of the door. "Do you regret building it?" Wren asked him once, near the end of the second year, sitting with him in the grown quiet while Thomas Vey hummed his cracked few notes at the light. Raven considered it honestly, because she had never once accepted anything less from him, and he had stopped, long ago, wanting to give her less. "I regret that I built it without asking what it was for," he said. "I regret Thomas, whom I built and did not warn. I regret every year I spent telling myself that clean hands were a thing you kept by handing the knife to someone worse." He looked at her. "But I do not regret building you, Wren, and I have thought about it a great deal, and I know how that sounds. I built a weapon. But the weapon turned out to be a person, and the person turned out to be a wall, and I have decided that the honest thing is not to regret the person because I am ashamed of the weapon. You are not the weapon I built. You are what you did with it. And what you did with it is the only thing I have ever made that I am not ashamed of, even though I did not in the end make it at all. You did." He folded his 4 hands. "I only opened the door. You were the one who walked around to the other side." The holdfast at Severn still stands. It stands whole and open in the hard gold light. 200 years of grown gray armor, and now a little more, because the small folk have kept growing it, the way they always have, the way they will after everyone in this valley is gone, not against the assault that never came back, but out of the old habit of a soft people in a hard world layering shelter against the dark one generation at a time. There is a human who lives inside it, and she is not young anymore, and her voice is a cracked and quiet thing that cannot break so much as a cup. She teaches the small folks young sometimes, in the warm-grown chambers, the plain old lines her grandmother taught her, and they cannot follow the tune and do not care, and she sings it cracked and human, and they gather close to listen, because a voice, she has told them in the ruined thread that is all she has left, is not for breaking things. It never was, it was for being heard. The conquered built the strongest weapon in the arm of the border, and handed it to a girl who had spent her whole life being underestimated by people who mistook quiet for weakness, and she took the weapon they made of her voice and turned it, once completely, into the only thing a hard world ever really rewards. Not the blade, not the key, the wall, the plain, patient, unglamorous thing that stands between the soft and the dark and asks for nothing and does not fall. They never did understand what they had built. They spent 9 days certain they held a sword, and they were wrong, and the being wrong cost them a valley and a border, and a story they will never fully bury. She was not a sword. She was the wall they never grew, and she held, and the soft folk behind her lived, and in the end that was the whole of it, and it was enough.